Welcome back, my friend. If this story keeps you company tonight, a like helps more than you'd think. It's how these stories find their way to more people like you. Now let's get into it. The first piece of the case that frightened me was not found in the backcountry. It was found in a locked freezer beneath fluorescent lights 3 weeks after we had returned. The freezer belonged to the wildlife lab near Mammoth. It had a digital alarm, a paper temperature log, and 2 shelves of samples that had frozen exactly as they were supposed to. On the bottom shelf sat 4 sealed bags of tissue taken from 4 elk. 3 of the bags were stiff enough to knock against the metal rack. The 4th remained soft. Frost melted in a ring around it, froze again near the edge, and left a shallow, clear moat in the ice. The technician moved the bag twice. She replaced the thermometer, checked the door seal, and placed control samples beside it. Each time, the controls froze and the tissue from the 4th elk warmed to roughly the temperature of a living animal. That is the detail the official report does not contain. The report says the sample was compromised by equipment failure and destroyed as a biological hazard. The freezer did not fail. I watched the technician open it, and I felt heat touch the back of my hand from more than a foot away. It was the same slow heat I had felt coming through the soles of my boots at Shon Geyser Basin, shortly before the ground began following us. My name is Jonah Reeves. I worked for the National Park Service for almost 15 years, 11 of them at Yellowstone. Most visitors met rangers at a desk, on a boardwalk, or beside a traffic jam caused by bison. My work was less visible. I handled backcountry patrols, resource violations, wildlife closures, missing hikers, and the practical problems that appear when more than 2 million acres of mountains, forest, rivers, and thermal ground are treated as both a protected ecosystem and a public destination. I was not a geologist or a wildlife veterinarian. I knew enough about both fields to recognize danger, document what I saw, and call the right specialist before a situation became worse. Yellowstone teaches that kind of humility quickly. A patch of pale soil may be solid rhyolite, or it may be a thin mineral roof above water hot enough to kill you. A bison that appears half asleep may cross 40 yards before a visitor finishes deciding whether to step back. A cloud of steam can be nothing more than cold air passing over a warm spring, or it can hide a hole that was not there the previous week. The safest employees were not the ones who believed they understood the park. They were the ones who remembered that it could change without asking their permission. I'll go. The incident happened during the last week of September, after the first hard frost had silvered the meadows, but before winter settled over the interior. The nights were long and cold at higher elevations. Lodgepole needles held beads of ice until sunlight reached them, while steam thickened above every warm drainage and drifted between the trunks like low cloud. Daytime weather remained mild enough for backcountry travel, but the season was turning. Bears were still active. Elk were moving through the rut. Afternoon storms could leave sleet on the Continental Divide, and a calm lake could darken under wind in minutes. Shoshone Geyser Basin lies near the western end of Shoshone Lake, far from any road. The usual foot route from the Old Faithful side crosses Grants Pass and requires a long day even for experienced hikers. There are no boardwalks through the basin. Visitors must remain on the established trail and treat every bare patch as unstable until proven otherwise. More than 80 geysers occupy a relatively small area, along with hot springs, fumaroles, damp mineral flats, and narrow channels whose temperature can change without visible warning. It is beautiful in the way a loaded firearm can be beautiful, precise, powerful, and indifferent to whether the person holding it has become careless. 2 backpackers brought us the first report. They arrived at Old Faithful shortly before dusk, tired and angry because another group had ignored their warnings near the basin. Their photograph showed a cow elk lying on its side about 20 yards from the trail. The animal did not appear decomposed. Its coat was wet along the ribs and pale vapor rose from its muzzle. The backpackers had assumed it had just died until they noticed the smell. It was not the ordinary musky odor of elk or the sweet, heavy odor of a fresh carcass. One of them compared it to wet wool left on a stove. They had seen a second carcass farther west, and what they believed was a third near the trees. No wolves or bears were feeding. Ravens sat in nearby lodgepoles, but would not come down. The other group, a pair of men with expensive cameras, had stepped off the trail to get closer. The backpackers watched them cross a gray mineral patch and disappear behind steam. They reappeared 10 minutes later, apparently unharmed, and refused to return when warned. We located them at their vehicle that evening. Both insisted the ground had been firm and that the elk had probably died from disease. One had touched the first carcass with the end of a trekking pole. He said the hide felt warm. Warmth in a carcass is not supernatural. Large animals lose heat slowly, especially in cold air. Sunlight can warm dark hair. Bacterial activity produces heat. An elk can die beside a thermal feature, and geothermal ground can keep the body warm long after the heart stops. Every part of that explanation was reasonable. The problem was the timing. The backpackers had passed through the basin 3 days earlier on their way around the lake. They had photographed the same cow from a distance because its position looked unnatural. The image was time-stamped. In it, the elk lay exactly where it appeared in the later photographs. 3 nights had passed, each cold enough to freeze water bottles left outside a tent. If the body was still warm, we needed to know why. If several elk had died in the same small area, we also had to consider disease, poisonous gas, contaminated water, illegal activity, and predation complicated by the thermal ground. The basin could not simply be closed with a chain across a trailhead. People approached it from several directions, and any closure would require signs, patrols, permit contacts, and a defensible reason. My supervisor, Paul Danner, assigned me to accompany Dr. Mara Bell, a wildlife biologist who had worked in the park longer than I had. Mara specialized in ungulates and disease surveillance. She was in her early 40s, methodical, and unimpressed by dramatic reports. Her field kit contained sample bags, swabs, disposable sleeves, a probe thermometer, flagging, and more protective equipment than most hikers carried clothing. We added a multi-gas meter, an infrared thermometer, a thermal camera used by the geology staff, a satellite communicator, bear spray, radios, overnight gear, and enough food for 3 days. A thermal technician was supposed to join us, but an injury on another assignment left him unavailable. He marked the known feature boundaries on our working map and warned us not to interpret surface temperature as proof of stable ground. A cold crust could cover hot water. A warm patch could be shallow sunlight. The pattern mattered more than a single reading. We left before sunrise. Frost whitened the trail near the divide, and our headlamps made the crystals glitter. The forest smelled of resin, coal dust, and the faint sulfur that seems to travel farther when the air is still. We crossed Grant's Pass after daylight and descended toward the lake through stands of lodgepole pine broken by open meadows. For the first several hours, nothing felt wrong. Clark's nutcrackers called from the higher trees. A red squirrel scolded us from a log. Fresh bear scat lay beside the trail, dark with berries, and an elk bugled somewhere beyond the ridge. Mara spoke only when the ground or the case required it. She pointed out tracks made by cows and calves, then the deeper, blunter impressions of a bull. Most led generally toward lower country. None showed panic. Near midday, a breeze moved through the forest and carried the clean mineral smell of Shoshone Lake. I remember feeling relieved by that smell. It gave the landscape an edge and a direction. The relief ended a little more than a mile from the basin. We found a raven standing in the middle of the trail. It did not hop away when we approached. It faced west toward the geysers, with its wings held slightly apart. Frost covered the shaded ground around it, but a narrow line beneath the bird was bare and dark. The line was no wider than my palm. It crossed the trail from north to south, continued under a fallen trunk, and vanished into grass. I stopped several yards away. The raven turned its head toward us, opened its beak, and made no sound. Then it lifted straight up and flew east, back the way we had come. Mara crouched beside the dark line without touching it. The infrared thermometer showed that the exposed soil was more than 40 degrees warmer than the frost on either side. A few inches north, it was cold. A few inches south, it was cold. There was no steam, no sulfur odor, and no mapped thermal feature nearby. Mara photographed the line and placed a small marker on cold ground beside it. I checked the map, then the canopy, looking for sunlight that had not yet reached the trail. The explanation did not fit the shape. Tree roots can carry heat from warm ground. Water can travel beneath the surface. Neither usually produces a straight, even strip that ends exactly where someone begins looking for it. We stepped across one at a time and continued west. For nearly an hour, normal forest sounds returned. The wind rose. Jays moved through the pines. Our radios carried routine traffic from developed areas too far away to see. The line became another measurement waiting for context. We smelled the first carcass before the trees opened onto the basin. It was not decay. It was hot hair. The cow lay on a slope of sparse grass between the trail and a cluster of dead lodgepoles. From a distance, her position suggested an animal sleeping with its legs folded beneath it. Up close, the posture was wrong. Her front knees were tucked against her chest, but both rear legs extended stiffly behind her. The neck curved uphill. One eye had dried cloudy and remained open. There were no tooth marks at the throat, no torn hide, and no blood on the soil. The abdomen had begun to swell, though not as much as I expected after 3 days. Several blowflies moved sluggishly on the hair near the mouth. None entered the nostrils. The backpacker had been right about the vapor. A thin thread emerged with steady regularity, drifted 6 inches, and disappeared. We approached from the trail side and stopped where the vegetation changed. Mara checked the air before we moved closer. Oxygen was normal. The meter showed no dangerous concentration of hydrogen sulfide or carbon monoxide. Gas is unreliable in open country because wind can clear a pocket before anyone measures it, but the breeze was weak, and the basin odor remained ordinary. Sulfur, damp clay, pine, and the metallic scent of hot water. We watched the ground. The grass beneath the cow was green where the surrounding blades had yellowed. Frost had melted in an oval extending roughly a foot beyond the body. Mara touched the hair with the back of a gloved hand, pulled away, then touched it again. She looked at me without speaking. I held the infrared thermometer over the ribcage. The surface reading varied with the wet coat, but the highest patch was warmer than a person's skin. The face and hindquarters were close to the surrounding air temperature. Heat was concentrated beneath the left shoulder. Mara inserted the probe through a small incision between the ribs. She did it slowly, expecting trapped gas or fluid. When the metal had entered only a few inches, the display rose above 100 degrees. She withdrew the probe and checked it against the air. It dropped immediately. The animal had been dead for at least 3 days, yet tissue near the chest remained at a temperature compatible with life. Bacterial decomposition can create local heat, but not like that in a cold, intact carcass. Mara collected swabs and small tissue samples, double-bagged them, and placed them in an insulated case. The incision released no steam. The vapor continued to leave the nostrils in evenly spaced threads. I moved around the perimeter on firm vegetated ground and searched for tracks. Elk had crossed the slope repeatedly. The dead cow's final approach was readable where the soil softened near a seep. Her stride was normal until she reached the place where she died. There were no long gouges from a fall, and no churned earth from convulsions. She had stopped, folded her front legs, and lowered herself. It looked as if she had chosen to bed down. A second set of tracks entered from the meadow, circled her once, and left. Coyote. The animal had come close enough to investigate, and then retreated without touching the body. Raven droppings marked the branches above us, but the carcass had not been opened by scavengers. In Yellowstone, meat rarely remains unclaimed. Even when large predators stay away, magpies, ravens, eagles, coyotes, foxes, insects, and smaller animals begin their work. Their refusal bothered Mara more than the temperature. The second elk lay a quarter-mile west, where mineral soil formed pale islands among sedges. It was a young bull with narrow antlers and a body too thin for the season. One side of the hide had been scalded. Hair separated in clumps when Mara lifted it, revealing red skin beneath, but the ground around the animal was cool. The nearest visible spring sat beyond a strip of grass, bubbling gently beneath a skin of blue water. If the bull had broken through there and staggered away, we should have found burned tracks. We found none. His hooves were intact. His final trail ran along ordinary soil and ended at the edge of the pale patch. Like the cow, he had lowered himself before he died. Unlike the cow, he was cold. The third carcass was not an elk. It was a coyote curled beside a lodgepole, tail over its nose with no visible injury. The soil under its abdomen measured nearly 80 degrees. When we rolled the animal using a long pole, the heat remained in the ground, not the body. It formed a narrow band leading away from the tree. The band curved through dead needles, crossed a shallow drainage, and entered the basin. Its width matched the line we had found beneath the Raven. I followed it with the infrared thermometer while staying on stable ground. The reading rose and fell slightly, but never spread more than a few inches. 20 yards from the coyote, the band turned west. Another 20 yards beyond that, it vanished beside one of our own footprints. Mara had crossed the spot earlier while searching for the bull's trail. Her boot mark was shallow in the mineral soil, clear enough to show the tread. The center of the impression had warmed. The surrounding surface had not. I measured the next print. Warm, that day. The third was warmer. By the fifth, a faint thread of vapor rose from the heel. The heat band had joined her path and was traveling along it one footprint at a time. We stepped back onto the established trail. Mara remained calm, but the muscles at her jaw had tightened. She asked for the thermal camera. Through its screen, the basin became a field of deep purple and bright white. Known springs burned at the edges. Warm channels branched through the ground like veins. Her boot prints appeared as orange shapes cooling behind her. The narrow band was different. It glowed white at the last print, faded to orange in the previous one, and darkened farther back. While we watched, the next footprint brightened. Nothing moved across the surface. No steam marked the space between the prints. Heat simply gathered in each depression, paused, and advanced. I told Paul what we had found. The radio connection was weak but usable. We avoided dramatic language. 3 wildlife mortalities, anomalous surface heat, possible changing thermal feature. He instructed us to document from stable ground, mark a conservative exclusion perimeter, and withdraw if conditions changed. A geology team could come in the following morning. We had enough daylight to leave the basin, but not enough to cross the divide comfortably before dark. Our planned camp stood east of the thermal area on a forested bench used by a backcountry staff. We decided to install 2 temperature loggers near the trail, place cameras where they could view the cow elk and the moving band, then return to camp. That decision seems reckless when described after the fact. And at the time, it followed our risk assessment. We were not standing over an erupting geyser. We were looking at a heat anomaly moving through an area built from heat anomalies. Our gas readings were safe. The trail remained intact. Weather was stable. Help knew our location. Nothing on the surface had moved except a temperature reading. We mounted the first camera on a tree facing the cow. The second went near the coyote, angled across the heat band. The loggers were small metal probes connected to recorders. We inserted them at the edge of established safe ground, not inside the warm strip. One would measure the anomaly. The other would serve as a control. By then, Mara's first footprint had cooled. The next several were cold as well. We watched the screen for nearly 10 minutes and saw no advance. I began to think the strip had been a transient flow of warm water taking advantage of compressed soil. Footsteps can redirect shallow runoff. An elk path can create channels invisible at the surface. The explanation was imperfect, but it belonged to the world we knew. Then the cow's head moved. It did not lift. The neck remained curved, and the eye remained fixed. The muzzle rotated perhaps an inch, dragging through grass. A wet sound came from inside the chest. Mara raised one hand to stop me from approaching. The vapor at the nostrils thickened. It emerged once, paused, then emerged again. I counted the intervals without intending to. 5 seconds. 5 seconds. 5 seconds. The animal's ribs did not rise. Something beneath the left shoulder was forcing warm air through a body that had no breath of its own. The ground darkened under the carcass. At first it looked like water rising through soil. The oval of green grass flattened and became glossy. The cow sank slowly, no more than half an inch, while bubbles appeared along the belly. A smell of burned hide rolled toward us. We moved farther back. Her front leg settled into the earth. The body tipped, exposing the incision Mara had made. From that small cut came a line of white steam. There was now a clear reason to leave. We collected the sample case, our hand tools, and the control logger. The camera near the cow could be abandoned. I reached for the other recorder from the trail side. Its screen showed a temperature rise so fast that the digits blurred. The probe cable twitched where it entered the soil. I pulled once and felt resistance, as though the wire had snagged on a root. When I pulled again, the cable came free without the probe. Its cut end was hot enough to soften the insulation. We backed east along the trail. Behind us, the wet sounds under the elk grew quieter. The steam did not. It spread low over the grass and followed the narrow, warm band toward the coyote. For the first time since entering the basin, I noticed there were no ravens in the trees. There were no nutcrackers, no squirrels, and no elk calling beyond the ridge. The breeze still moved the lodgepole tops, but the basin beneath them had lost every smaller sound. Our staff camp was less than 2 miles from the western group of thermal features, on a bench high enough to remain dry during spring runoff. 2 tent pads had been cleared among the pines years earlier. A steel food pole stood at the edge of the opening, and a narrow path descended to a cold stream. Nothing about the site suggested geothermal activity. Grass grew thick around the trees. Moss covered the north side of fallen logs. The geology map showed no known warm ground within half a mile. We reached it before sunset and checked every area where we planned to stand or sleep. Surface temperatures were uniform. The gas meter remained quiet. I scraped away a layer of needles beside the tent pads and found cold, damp soil. Mara examined the samples while I hung our food. All 4 bags from the cow had warmed inside the insulated case, though we had packed them with frozen blocks. The control vial, which contained only sterile solution, remained cold. One tissue bag felt hot through 2 layers of plastic. Mara moved it into a separate rigid container and placed the container on a flat stone away from our tents. She recorded every step in her field notebook. Her handwriting was normally small and even. That evening, the lines drifted upward across the page. We discussed possible causes while daylight faded. A hydrothermal channel could have opened beneath the animals. Gas could have killed them before the ground heated. The cow might have remained warm because steam had entered the body cavity through an injury we had not found. Heat following footprints was harder to explain, but compacted soil transmits water differently from loose soil. The coyote might have died from scavenging another contaminated carcass. Ravens might have avoided the bodies because sulfur or another chemical masked the scent. Each explanation solved one piece. None solved all of them. Mara was especially troubled by the absence of burns on the cow's hooves and the position of the coyote. Animals living near thermal country learn to avoid unstable surfaces. They make mistakes, but 3 species do not usually make the same mistake in the same week. At dusk, Paul called through the satellite communicator. The geology team would leave at first light and meet us on the trail east of the basin. A second ranger would accompany them. We were to remain at camp and avoid the thermal area until they arrived. The instruction was reassuring because it turned the night into a waiting period. We ate, completed our notes, checked weather, and set alarms to inspect the sample container every 2 hours. Wind moved over the bench in long, cold breaths. Normal sounds returned around us. A squirrel worked in the food pole tree. Something small moved through dry needles near the stream. Far away, an elk bugled, and another answered. The forest seemed to have closed behind the basin. The temperature fell quickly after dark. Frost formed on the tent flies. I wore a wool hat inside my sleeping bag and kept my boots beneath the vestibule so they would not freeze. Mara's tent stood 15 feet away. We left the gas meter between us, close enough that either person would hear the alarm. I slept lightly, waking whenever the wind changed. At some point after midnight, I dreamed I was back, beside the cow elk, and could hear it breathing under the soil. The breaths came faster until they matched my own. Then a pain in my shoulder pulled me awake. The ground beneath me was hot. Heat pressed through the sleeping pad along the entire right side of my body. It was not enough to burn, but it had penetrated my clothing and tightened the muscles along my ribs. The tent air smelled of warm nylon and damp earth. I sat up. The pain shifted from my shoulder to my hip as my weight moved. Beneath the fabric, something made a faint clicking sound. It was the sound of small stones expanding beside a fire. I called Mara's name once. She answered immediately. Her voice was low and alert. Her tent floor had warmed beneath her legs. We did not waste time dressing fully. I pulled on boots, grabbed my pack and radio, and stepped onto the cold margin of the clearing. Mara did the same. Steam rose from both tent pads after our weight left them. It seeped through seams in the fabric and curled around the rain flies. The gas meter remained silent. We moved to the food pole, keeping to grass. The ground there measured normal. I aimed the thermal camera at the tents. 2 bright human-shaped areas glowed through the fabric, each matching the place where a sleeping body had rested. Beneath them, a narrow, warm line approached from the west. It passed between tree roots, crossed the clearing, and divided before reaching us. One branch ended beneath my tent. The other ended beneath Mara's. The line had not followed a known drainage. It had climbed the slope. The sample container sat on its stone 30 yards away. On the screen it looked white. The line passed within a few feet of it without turning. Whatever was moving through the ground was not simply seeking the hottest object. It had ignored tissue from the cow and found 2 living bodies. I checked the route we had taken from the basin. Patches of warmth appeared at intervals along the path where our boots had compressed the soil. They were too far apart to form a continuous channel. The lion had used them anyway. We withdrew to the cold stream. Its banks were gravel and exposed stone, with little soil to hold a track. The water came from higher ground east of the basin and ran cold enough to numb a hand. We crossed on a fallen lodgepole and stood on the opposite bank. It was not a good place to spend the night. The slope rose steeply behind us, and wet brush covered the only level ground. We remained standing. 10 minutes passed. The steam over our tents thinned. 20 minutes passed. A red glow moved along the thermal camera screen toward the tree line, following the path we had taken to the stream. Mara said, "It waited until we slept." That was the longest sentence either of us spoke for a while. The same thought had already formed in my mind. The cow elk had bedded down. The coyote had curled beneath a tree. The bull had folded his legs. The raven had stood motionless on the trail. Heat appeared beneath living things after they remained in one place. Their own tracks gave it a route. Movement delayed it. Rest invited it closer. We climbed the eastern slope instead of returning to camp. Walking kept us warm, but sweat in cold air creates its own danger. We opened jackets, shortened our steps, and maintained a pace we could hold until daylight. Every few minutes we checked the ground behind us. The warm line advanced slowly, usually several hundred yards back. When we crossed rock, it stopped. When we returned to soil, isolated impressions began to warm. It did not take the shortest route. It took hours. Shortly before 2 a.m, we reached a broad outcrop of rhyolite above the stream. Wind had swept it clean. No soil covered the center, and the thermal camera showed an even field of cold stone. We stepped onto it and waited near opposite edges so our combined heat would not concentrate in one place. The outcrop was wide enough that the warm line could not follow compressed soil across it. For almost an hour, nothing changed. We drank water, ate quickly, and added dry layers. I contacted Paul and reported a possible migrating thermal hazard at our camp. I told him we had evacuated to bedrock and were stable. He asked if either of us was injured. I said no. He asked whether we could return by the eastern route without passing the basin. I told him we could, but the safest decision was to hold until the other team approached in daylight. There were cliffs and thick deadfall east of the drainage. Night travel would exchange one poorly understood risk for several familiar ones. Around 3, the wind stopped. The night became so still that I could hear water moving under ice along the stream. Mara stood at the far side of the outcrop, sweeping the thermal camera over the slope. I watched the forest with my headlamp off. Stars showed between the lodgepole crowns. A faint orange shimmer appeared low among the trunks, then another. It was not light. It was steam-catching starlight rising from separate patches of ground. Each patch marked a place where we had paused during our climb. The vapor columns appeared one after another. They did not hurry. The first faded as the second strengthened. The second faded as the third rose. The sequence climbed toward us with the patience of someone following trail markers. When the last patch at the edge of the trees began to steam, the smell of hot hair reached the rock. Mara aimed the camera down. A narrow white shape had appeared beneath the outcrop. It did not cross the stone. It spread along the edge, searching left and right where soil met rock. We moved toward the center. The white band widened. For the first time, I felt a vibration through my boots. It was weak, almost below sensation, but it repeated at a steady interval. The rock warmed by a single degree. Then another. The thing had not crossed the stone. It had gone under it. The temperature of the outcrop continued to rise. Not quickly, but evenly, as if the entire slab had been placed over a low flame. There was no cracking, no sudden jet of steam, and no visible route for hot water. The warmth arrived first beneath my boots, then beneath Mara's, although we stood on different sides. When we moved again, it followed our weight. A pale film of condensation appeared on the rock between us. We could not remain there until daylight. We had two choices. We could continue east through steep forest toward the trail over Grant's Pass, or descend west to our camp and regain the established route near the basin. East led away from the known thermal features, which should have made it safer. It also led through miles of soil where our own tracks would provide a continuous path. The geology team was approaching from that direction. If the heat reached their route before we warned them, 4 more people could walk directly into it without knowing they should not stop. West led closer to the source, but it offered gravel bars, mineral flats, and the mapped trail through an area already saturated with geothermal heat. Through the camera, the distant basin looked like a white wall. If the moving band was finding us by our warmth against cold ground, the basin might conceal us in plain sight. I called Paul and told him to hold the incoming team at Grant's Pass. The satellite connection dropped twice. On the third attempt, my message went through. He did not like our plan, but he understood the reasoning. No one was to enter the drainage until we reached the eastern trail and reported clear. If we failed to check in by late morning, the response would be treated as a rescue in an unstable thermal zone. That distinction mattered. Searchers do not rush onto hot ground because the people ahead of them are in danger. One casualty is not improved by creating 5 more. We left the rock before 4. To avoid giving the heat a single path, we did not follow our old tracks. We moved downhill over deadfall, stone, and patches of frozen grass, changing surfaces whenever possible. The method slowed us. It also forced us into brush that soaked our lower clothing. Within half an hour, ice formed on Mara's pant cuffs. The warm line remained behind us, but it no longer behaved as a single strip. Small hot spots appeared beside us where we had not stepped. One opened beneath a log I was using for balance. Sap hissed from the wood. Another warmed the base of a pine several yards ahead, and resin ran from a split in the bark. The phenomenon had learned the direction of our travel. It was no longer limited to the exact depressions we left. We passed through a meadow near the stream. Elk had crossed it during the night. Their tracks entered from the north, milled in the grass, then turned sharply east. None had bedded. At the western edge, 3 dark ovals marked places where frost had melted beneath standing animals. Beyond the ovals, the hoofprints lengthened into a run. The herd had felt the heat gather and moved before it could hold them. That explained why some elk had survived and others had not. It also told me the process was not new. Wildlife had learned a rule we were only beginning to understand. Our camp appeared through the trees in the first gray light before dawn. Both tents had collapsed. The center of each pad had sunk into a shallow bowl filled with cloudy water. Steam moved above the fabric. The food pole leaned toward the west, its base surrounded by black mud. Our sample container still rested on the stone, but the rigid outer shell had warped. One side had softened around the tissue bag and hardened again. We did not approach it. The sample had been useful only when we believed we were investigating dead animals. By then, the living were the priority. We retrieved nothing from the tents. Our packs contained emergency layers, food, communication, and first aid. Everything else could be replaced. We followed the stream downstream until gravel widened along its bank, then crossed toward the established trail. The basin odor strengthened. Sulfur coated the back of my throat. Steam drifted between trees and sheets, turning headlamp beams into white walls. Dawn did not brighten the forest so much as give the vapor a color. The thermal camera began warning that its battery was low. Before it failed, Mara took one last sweep behind us. The display showed dozens of isolated hotspots spread across the slope. Together they formed no animal or person, only a rough vertical concentration where the cold forest should have been. The lower portion was narrow. Higher up, branches of heat extended to either side through roots and damp soil. It seemed tall because the ground rose behind it. That is the explanation I wrote later. At the time, when the shape stopped wherever we stopped and widened whenever we looked back, it felt as if something enormous was standing under the forest and pressing its outline upward through the surface. The screen went black. We continued without it. We reached the basin trail shortly after sunrise. Frost edged the sedges, but every spring and fumarole breathed into the cold air. Steam columns leaned east under a light wind. Water clicked in small channels. Geysers farther west released deep, muffled surges that could be felt through the soles of our boots. The natural noise was constant and layered. After hours of listening for a single hidden vibration, the basin sounded almost crowded. The known trail curved between mineral flats and vegetated ground. We stayed precisely on it. That was not only park policy. It was the one route inspected often enough to offer any confidence. The first 100 yards passed without incident. Warmth existed everywhere. It came from springs, runoff, vents, and sunless soil. Nothing isolated our footprints. Nothing followed them. Mara and I did not say that the idea had worked. Speaking, it felt premature. Near the first large geyser group, we encountered the cow elk again. At least I believed it was the same cow. The cloudy eye, the folded front legs, and the small incision between the ribs were visible through steam. She lay on a mineral flat more than half a mile from the place where we had left her. One side of the body had sunk into gray clay. The rest appeared intact. There were no drag marks across the intervening ground, and no predator tracks. A narrow dark channel entered beneath her from the east, following the general route we had taken to camp. The earth had not carried heat from the carcass. It had carried the carcass with the heat. Mara stopped for only a few seconds. The ground behind her boot made a soft popping sound. She moved again. A spot beside the cow's chest inflated like a bubble under thick paint. The hide lifted, and warm vapor flowed from the nostrils. The head rotated toward the trail. Its motion was slow and entirely mechanical, pushed by pressure from below, but the dead eye turned with it until the pupil faced us. The trail narrowed beside a shallow, hot channel. Mineral deposits formed scalloped white edges around clear water. I placed each foot inside the previous wear marks. Mara followed. Halfway across, the bank collapsed beneath her left heel. Her boot broke through the crust and dropped into water deeper than it appeared. She pulled free immediately, but a burst of steam wrapped her lower leg. I caught her pack and kept her from falling onto the bank. The smell of heated leather mixed with sulfur. The water had entered above her boot. When we reached a wider patch of trail, she tried to keep moving, then stumbled. We had to stop. I cut the laces, removed the boot and sock, and poured cool drinking water over the burn. The skin from her ankle to the lower calf was red, with one pale patch beginning to blister. It was serious but not immediately disabling. She could bear our weight for short periods. I covered it loosely with a sterile dressing and helped her put on a dry sock and a camp shoe from her pack. The entire treatment took less than 4 minutes. During those minutes, the basin changed. The geyser noise faded one feature at a time. A vent that had hissed continuously fell silent. A bubbling pool flattened. The hot channel beside us stopped flowing. Steam thinned until the air cleared enough to see across the mineral flat. Heat had not increased beneath us. It had been drawn away. Every active feature in sight was becoming quiet, as if the plumbing below the basin had turned toward the two living bodies on the trail. Mara saw it before I did. A line of moisture appeared between her camp shoe and the pale ground. It traced the outside edge of her sole, darkening the mineral crust. Another line formed around my knee where I had crouched to dress the burn. Neither surface was hot yet. The moisture came from below, pushed upward by pressure. We stood and moved. Mara used one trekking pole on her right side and my shoulder on her left. We could not hurry without risking a fall, so we maintained a steady three-legged rhythm. Pole, my right foot, her good foot, then the injured one. The trail curved through a cluster of low vents that had stopped producing steam. Condensation dripped from their rims. Each time Mara's weight touched the ground, I felt her brace against pain. She made no sound. The basin remained unnaturally clear around us. Behind us, the spot where we had treated her boot began to bulge. The pale surface lifted, split, and released a narrow jet of brown water. It rose only a few feet before collapsing, but the next patch opened closer. Then, another. The eruptions followed the exact places where we had stood. I understood then that the heat was not moving like an animal through a tunnel. It was changing the hydrothermal system itself, opening temporary connections beneath weight, warmth, or both. The thing I had imagined under the forest had no need for a body. Its body was every crack carrying superheated water toward the surface. The trail ahead crossed a broad center apron. Almost no vegetation grew there, and shallow runoff from several springs spread in braided films across the white surface. Under ordinary conditions, we would have passed quickly and stayed within the worn center. That morning, the springs feeding it had gone still. The apron looked dry. I knew dry did not mean safe. It meant the water had gone somewhere else. Mara's leg buckled near the middle. I held her upright, but we lost our rhythm. Her injured foot remained planted for several seconds. A vibration rose through the trail. To our left, an empty vent inhaled with a deep, hollow sound. To our right, the mineral film cracked in a curve. The crack did not race toward us. It closed around us. We could not go backward. The temporary jets had opened across the trail behind. Ahead, the apron extended to a low ridge of old cinder where the route entered grass. I shifted Mara's arm higher over my shoulders and told her we were going to keep moving even if I had to take most of her weight. "Man to you." She nodded once. We stepped over the forming crack. The first place my boot landed softened. Hot mud pressed around the sole without breaking through. I pulled free and placed the next foot on a raised mineral rib. Mara swung forward using the pole. Beneath us came the wet, heavy sounds I had heard under the cow. The clear air filled again with the smell of burned hair, though neither of us was burned above the boot. I looked back once. Steam was rising from the crack in a shape taller than a person. Through it, the cow elk appeared to be standing. I do not mean the body had returned to life. I never saw it place a hoof or support its own weight. Pressure had lifted the front half while the hindquarters remained buried in clay. The folded legs hung beneath the chest. Steam inflated the hide and held the neck upright. The cloudy eye faced the trail. Behind that body, vapor gathered into a larger form that never kept the same edge for more than a second. A slope became a shoulder. A dead tree became an arm. An opening in the steam became a mouth until the wind shifted and proved it empty. I saw only pieces because pieces were all there was to see. The cow's chest expanded. Every quiet vent around us answered with a low knock. Mara drove her pole forward. We moved across the apron while the first new jet broke behind us. Hot water struck my pack and ran off the fabric. Another burst open to our left. The center under my next step flexed. I changed direction within the trail, choosing the darker strip where old foot traffic had exposed gravel. The gravel held. We followed it toward the ridge. The largest geyser in the nearby group erupted before we reached the grass. There was no gentle beginning. Water and steam rose above the basin with a concussion that struck my chest. The column vanished into white vapor, and hot runoff poured into channels on both sides of the trail. Other features restarted almost at once. A pool began hammering against its rim. Fumaroles hissed. The ground released the pressure it had drawn toward us. The steam behind the elk lost its height. The carcass folded slowly and disappeared into vapor. The cracks around our footprints filled with water, but the advancing sequence stopped. Heat had become heat again, dispersed through thousands of fractures instead of gathered along our path. We reached the grass and did not rest. I supported Mara east along the trail until vegetation gave way to gravel beside the stream. From there, we climbed toward the divide at a pace that would have seemed painfully slow on any ordinary patrol. Behind us, Shoshone Basin breathed and surged with its usual noise. No narrow line warmed our footprints. No vapor rose where we paused long enough to drink. Birds began calling after sunrise cleared the ridge. The first sound was a raven somewhere above us. It called once, waited, and called again. The geology team met us below Grant's Pass. Their medic treated Mara's burn and placed her lower leg in a padded splint. 2 rangers assisted her toward the trailhead while I gave Paul a short account through the radio. No one entered the basin that day. The cameras, tents, logger, carcasses, and sample container remained where we had left them. Weather moved in by afternoon. Sleet crossed the divide, followed by wet snow. By the time a qualified team returned 2 days later, the forest camp had cooled. The tent pads were shallow, muddy depressions. The warped sample container was still on the stone, and the tissue inside remained warm. The recovery team found no continuous hot channel between the basin and our camp. They found scattered warm pockets beneath soil, roots, and stone, none hotter than features documented elsewhere in the park. The outcrop where we had waited was cold. Its surface showed hairline fractures that did not appear in my photographs from that night, but frost had entered the cracks, and no one could determine when they formed. The cow elk was gone. In its original location, the ground had collapsed into a shallow pool too unstable to approach. Near the center apron, the team found hair, a section of hide, and the tip of one antler embedded in new mineral deposits. Those remains could have belonged to either elk. No one attempted to excavate them. One camera survived. Its housing had discolored from heat, but most images remained on the card. For several hours the frames showed the cow exactly as we had seen her. Then steam obscured the lens. The next clear image showed an empty depression. There was no picture of the carcass moving, no person entering the frame, and no large predator. The camera had been triggered repeatedly, yet each obscured interval lasted long enough for something to happen outside our view. The second camera was found partly submerged at the coyote site. Its battery compartment had melted. The temperature logger stored one useful record before the probe failed. It showed a sharp heat increase, a pause, then another increase, several feet away. The sequence continued at intervals, matching a slow human walk. The geology staff explained that pressure changes can make apparently separate features respond together. They could not explain why the intervals followed the spacing of Mara's footprints. Mara spent several days receiving treatment outside the park. The burn healed without surgery, though the pale patch near her ankle remained numb. She returned to work before winter, first in the office and later in the field. We spoke about the incident only when the investigation required it. Neither of us wanted to build a story around what we had seen. Stories harden uncertains into shapes. Once people imagine a creature, they begin altering evidence to fit it. We agreed on the facts we could defend. Animals had died. Heat had persisted in one carcass. Ground temperatures had shifted along our route. Our camp had become thermally active. Features in the basin had gone quiet before erupting again. Everything beyond that belonged to interpretation. The official conclusion was a newly active, shallow hydrothermal system, complicated by wildlife mortality, darkness, fatigue, and rapidly changing weather. That conclusion was not dishonest. Yellowstone's thermal basins do change. Water follows fractures, pressure redirects flow, and a safe-looking surface can fail without warning. The report recommended additional monitoring and conservative travel restrictions for staff until the area stabilized. It did not mention steam shaped like a standing animal. It did not describe heat dividing beneath two tents. It did not say the ground had chosen our footprints when many easier routes existed. The samples were transferred to the lab. Tests for common disease agents did not identify a cause of death, although decomposition and heat limited what could be concluded. 3 bags froze normally. Tissue from the cow's chest did not. For nearly a week, the sealed bag warmed every container that held it. When placed in the locked freezer, it melted a ring into the frost while the chamber remained below freezing. The freezer alarm recorded no fault. The lab technician eventually noticed another pattern. The tissue cooled whenever it rested on a metal shelf. It warmed when placed on insulating plastic, foam, or ice. Metal carried the heat away faster than it could gather. That observation may have been ordinary thermodynamics. It also matched our experience on gravel, exposed rock, and the mineral apron, where the ground could not hold a clean impression of us. The tissue was incinerated with other biological waste after the investigation closed. Mara objected at first, then withdrew the objection. Keeping it served no medical purpose, and no facility wanted responsibility for an unexplained warm sample from an unknown wildlife death. The paper temperature log remains the strongest physical record I have seen. I kept a photocopy. The line rises while the bag rests, falls after it is moved to metal, and rises again when returned to its tray. Nothing on the page says why. That winter, I searched old thermal observation files for Shawnee Basin. Most contained routine measurements, eruption notes, hand-drawn maps, and warnings about altered runoff. In a field notebook from the early 1970s, I found 3 lines written beside a sketch of the western features. The ranger had recorded 4 elk standing through a night of heavy frost. None bedded. At sunrise, narrow strips of bare earth crossed the meadow between them. The final note read, "Animals moved before warming reached resting sites." There was no follow-up and no suggestion of anything supernatural. A different hand had added that the pattern was probably shallow runoff. I stayed at Yellowstone for 2 more years. I never returned to the western end of Shoshone Geyser Basin, and I never again slept on a tent pad without first checking the ground beneath it. That habit followed me even outside thermal country. I would wake during patrols, press a palm to the floor, and wait for ordinary cold. Most nights, that was all I found. The last time I saw the pattern was near Madison Junction in early spring. Snow covered the meadow except for a narrow dark line running between the river and a group of elk. The animals stood close together in the pre-dawn cold. Several lowered their heads, but none folded their legs. One young cow began to kneel. An older cow struck her shoulder with its muzzle and forced her upright. A few seconds later, steam rose from the place where the young animal had almost rested. I was inside a vehicle on pavement. I could have stopped, photographed the line, and called it in. Instead, I kept driving until the meadow disappeared behind the trees. I had spent my career believing that animals needed us to recognize dangers they could not understand. At Shoshone, I learned the opposite. The elk did not need a name for what moved beneath them. They did not need a report, an instrument, or a theory. They only needed to feel the first warmth under their feet and refuse to lie down. The boot was standing on the shaded side of the dune, buried to the ankle and pointed toward the mountains. It was a good leather hiking boot, dark brown, recently treated with wax. The laces were tied. The tongue was tucked flat. Nothing about it suggested that someone had kicked it off or lost it in a slide. I thought the owner's foot was still inside until I knelt several feet uphill and brushed loose sand from the cuff with the handle of my trekking pole. The boot did not bend. It had been packed so tightly that it remained upright after the slope around it began to crumble. When enough sand fell away, I could see into the opening. There was no sock, no bone, and no blood. The interior was hollow all the way to the toe. The leather was still warm from the previous day, but the sand inside felt cold enough to numb my fingertips through a glove. My name is Nora Hale. I spent 9 years as a ranger at Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve in southern Colorado. Most people know the park from photographs taken near the main parking area. They see a bright field of sand rising in front of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, with children playing in Medano Creek and visitors carrying rented boards toward the first ridge. From that distance, the dunes look simple. They appear dry, open, and impossible to get lost in because there are no trees to block the view. That impression lasts until a person walks into them. A ridge that seemed close from the valley floor can require an hour of climbing. Every crest hides another system of bowls and saddles. Wind erases a trail while you stop to drink. In afternoon light, depth becomes difficult to judge because a gentle slope and a vertical slip face can share the same color. At night, the entire Dunnafield loses scale. There may be stars from one horizon to the other, but the ground beneath them becomes a series of black edges with no reliable distance between them. The dunes are not a pile of sand left behind by accident. They are one moving part of a larger system. Wind carries grains from the San Luis Valley toward the mountain front. Storm winds come back from the northeast and push against the prevailing flow. Medano Creek and Sand Creek collect sand at the edges and return it to the valley, where it can begin the cycle again. Most of the Dunnafield consists of reversing dunes shaped by those opposing winds. Individual ridges can shift quickly, even when the large forms seem unchanged for generations. The protected side of an active ridge builds until it reaches a steep angle. Then a sheet of grains releases and slides. When enough dry sand moves together, air is forced through millions of tumbling grains, and the dune produces a deep humming sound. Visitors call it singing. Some call it booming. On a quiet day, you can feel it through your boots before you recognize it as sound. I had heard the dunes boom hundreds of times. I had produced the sound deliberately during programs by pushing sand down a slip face. I had felt entire slopes vibrate under thunderstorms and watched storm winds flip sharp crests backward within minutes. That knowledge is why I did not become frightened when we found the buried boot. I became careful. There is a difference. Fear tries to name a danger before it understands it. Training asks what can move, what can fail, and which assumption is about to hurt someone. The incident began in late August, near the end of a dry summer. Medano Creek had retreated from the main visitor area weeks earlier. A shallow ribbon still ran along the eastern edge near Castle Creek, but most of the creek bed looked dry. Afternoon thunderstorms had crossed the valley for 3 days, bringing lightning and sudden wind, though little rain reached the main dunes. Nights remained cold at the valley's high elevation. By midnight, a person who had spent the afternoon protecting themselves from hot sand could be shivering in the same clothing. Two backpackers were scheduled to leave the dunes backcountry on a Monday morning. Their permit listed Gabriel Ross as the trip leader and Claire Sutton as the second member. Both were in their early 30s, experienced enough to carry proper water, navigation equipment, and layered clothing. Their planned route was not a fixed trail. Backcountry campers in the Dunnifield choose their own path and camp beyond the day-use area, out of sight of the developed corridor. Gabriel had described a general destination north of the first high ridges and an intended exit before the heat built. When their vehicle remained in the overnight lot that afternoon, no emergency was declared. People change pace, sleep late, or take a longer line through the dunes. When the same vehicle remained after dark and neither backpacker answered a phone, we began the overdue procedure. Lightning prevented an immediate response. A person standing on a ridge would have been the tallest object for hundreds of yards. We checked the vehicle, contacted the permit emergency number, and learned that the pair had promised to send a message before driving to Santa Fe. They had not sent it. A hasty team searched the accessible edge after the storm passed, but found no light, voice, or descending tracks. Wind had crossed the Dunnifield for more than an hour. Any prints on exposed ridges were gone. At first light, I entered with Jonah Lane, one of our most reliable backcountry rangers. Jonah had worked mountain rescue before coming to the park, and understood that open terrain can conceal a person as completely as forest. We carried overnight equipment, extra water, radios, a satellite communicator, marking wands, binoculars, and a compact litter package cached for a larger team behind us. The storm had cleaned the air. To the west, the San Luis Valley stretched flat and pale beneath a blue sky. To the east, the Sangre de Cristo peaks were dark with lingering cloud. Wet sand near the edge smelled faintly of stone and clay. Farther in, the air became dry enough that the inside of my nose burned. Gabriel had told his sister he wanted to camp where high ridges hid the visitor lights. That put the pair beyond the popular dunes, probably in one of the broad northern basins. With no tracks to guide us, we navigated by compass, GPS, and large terrain forms. We stopped below each crest, listened, and scanned the next bowl before descending. Sand hissed from the sharpest ridges, but there were no voices from early hikers and no ravens overhead. The silence did not feel wrong. Not yet. It felt washed clean. We found the first piece of gear after a little more than 2 hours. A red stuff sack lay in the bottom of a shallow bowl. It contained a sleeping pad and had been zipped closed. There were no drag marks or scattered contents around it. The surface showed faint rain dimples preserved beneath a newer dusting of blown sand. That told us the sack had been exposed during at least part of the storm and had not moved far afterward. A normal gust can carry an empty sack over multiple ridges, but this one weighed several pounds. It should have rolled, bounced, and left interruptions in the damp surface. Instead, it stood on its round end as though someone had placed it there after the wind stopped. Jonah photographed it before we touched anything. 50 yards farther north, we found a trekking pole planted vertically to the handle. The wrist strap rested on the sand. The basket and lower shaft were buried. Beyond the pole, near the shaded face of a taller reversing dune, we found the boot. The three objects formed a line. The line pointed uphill. We climbed around the side rather than step directly onto the steep face. Near the crest, my pole struck something solid. I expected another buried item. Instead, the sand broke away from a strip of orange fabric. Jonah and I cleared the area carefully, working from above to avoid triggering a slide onto whatever lay beneath. The orange widened into the roof panel of a backpacking tent. It was not flattened. Both poles remained arched. The fabric was under tension. As we removed sand, the shape of the tent emerged in its normal pitched form, except that the entire structure stood beneath nearly 4 feet of packed sand. That was the moment the case stopped looking like an ordinary navigation emergency. A windstorm can bury a tent. It can collapse poles, tear fabric, snap stakes, and push sand through every opening. It cannot place several feet of sand over a lightweight shelter while leaving the roof arched, the guy lines taut, and the space inside completely empty. We had uncovered only part of one wall when the slope beneath us released. A sheet of dry sand slid past the tent and moved toward the bowl below. The grains produced a low, familiar hum. It deepened as the slide widened. I felt the vibration through my knees and placed one hand against the slope to steady myself. The visible avalanche stopped after several seconds. The vibration under my palm continued. It traveled uphill. I lifted my hand so quickly that I nearly lost my balance. The surface looked still. A few grains clicked down the slope, then nothing moved. The sensation remained in my fingertips, a fine numbness like the memory of power equipment after the motor has been switched off. Jonah had felt it through his boots. He moved to the crest and watched the surrounding faces for a secondary slide. There was no wind strong enough to start one. The only sound came from sand settling around the exposed tent. We marked our route to the crest and called the find in. Radio coverage inside the Dunnifield was inconsistent, but our transmission reached the incident lead after 2 attempts. I described the location, the gear, and the absence of the missing backpackers. I did not describe the vibration as moving uphill. I reported prolonged subsurface resonance after a small sand avalanche. That language was accurate and useful. It suggested unstable ground and gave the incoming team a reason not to crowd the slope. Before they arrived, Jonah and I documented the campsite. The tent door faced west and remained zipped from the outside. When we cleared enough space to open it, sand did not pour from the interior. The floor was almost clean. 2 shallow depressions marked where sleeping pads had been placed, but only one pad remained. A sleeping bag lay folded at the foot of the tent, dry and free of sand. Beside it stood a metal mug with a thin line of dried tea at the bottom. The mug did not tip when I opened the door. A headlamp rested on top of it. Everything inside appeared arranged for a quiet evening, then sealed inside a rigid mold while the surrounding dune filled around it. Claire's pack was missing. Gabriel's pack lay 5 yards downhill, completely buried except for one shoulder strap. His water reservoir was half full. His food canister remained locked. We found both phones inside a waterproof pouch in the tent, which explained why neither person had answered. One had no battery. The other powered on and showed no useful signal history after late afternoon. Its last photograph was a wide image of the campsite before sunset. The tent stood on a flat shelf below the crest. Gabriel's boot was visible near the entrance. Claire was not in frame. Behind the tent, the slip face descended smoothly into the bowl. Nothing in the photograph suggested deep burial, severe wind, or immediate danger. The timestamp placed the photograph less than 2 hours before the storm reached the park. It gave us a comparison. The crest above the tent had shifted backward under northeast wind, which was normal for a reversing dune. Sand had been pushed onto the southwest face and then partially returned after the wind changed. The campsite had been placed in a poor location. Even experienced hikers underestimate how quickly a lee slope can rebuild. A buried tent was plausible. Its condition was not. We searched the surrounding bowl on a widening spiral. Surface tracking was nearly useless after the storm, but damp pockets preserved fragments. 20 yards from the tent, Jonah found the heel of a boot print. A second partial print appeared uphill. Both matched the size and general tread of the empty boot. The direction suggested Gabriel had climbed toward the crest. The track ended after less than 6 feet. Claire's shoes had a narrower sole with a broken diagonal bar, visible in the permit photograph she had submitted. We found one clean impression near the tent door. There was no next step, no scuff, and no return print. The impression was deep at the heel and light at the toe, as if she had shifted her weight forward without lifting her foot. I used a small brush to examine the edge. The sand had not collapsed into it. Instead, grains were packed along the sides, forming a crisp wall that extended farther down than a normal print. I slid a thin probe beside the heel. It entered almost 18 inches without resistance. When I withdrew it, the hole stayed open. Jonah knelt on the other side and inserted a longer wand at an angle. The tip should have crossed mine. It did not. His wand moved through empty space, then struck compacted sand below. We had found a narrow vertical cavity beneath the footprint. It was shaped like the lower part of a leg. We did not excavate it. Unstable sand can bury rescuers faster than people imagine, and the cavity might have been connected to a larger collapse. We flagged the perimeter and waited for the technical team. While we waited, I checked the tent photograph again. Claire was not visible, but her shadow crossed the lower right corner. The angle placed her a few feet from Gabriel. She had been standing beside the tent when he took the picture. The shadow ended at the edge of the frame below her knees. 3 more rangers and a local search volunteer reached us near midday. The incident lead remained at the visitor center, coordinating weather, medical standby, and additional resources. We divided the immediate area into lanes and kept the number of people on the steep face low. One rescuer used a probe to define the cavity beneath Claire's print. It descended nearly 6 feet. The cross-section widened at shoulder height, narrowed near the waist, and divided below. The shape was not perfect. Sand had sloughed into parts of it. Even so, no one needed to say what the measurements resembled. We had a hollow volume in the dune matching the outline of a person standing upright. There was no person inside it. A second cavity began beneath the empty boot, and widened where a bent knee might have been. Probing suggested a connected space running toward the tent, though no tunnel remained open. Each probe hole stayed clear for several seconds, then filled from below. Sand rose into the channels instead of falling from the sides. Groundwater can move sediment that way near a saturated creek bed. We were high inside the dry Dunnafield. The grains that rose were cold and carried no moisture. By early afternoon, thunderheads were building over the mountains. The temperature on exposed sand had climbed enough to soften boot soles, and everyone was drinking faster than planned. We suspended excavation and shifted to a surface search of nearby basins. Searchers worked in pairs. A drone was not an option, because flights are prohibited without an approved emergency operation, and even an authorized aircraft would have struggled to distinguish a body from thousands of shifting shadows. We requested aviation support but knew the storm might keep it grounded. Our best tools were eyes, route discipline, and the probability that 2 backpackers would seek lower, firmer terrain after losing shelter. Jonah and I searched the interdunal flats to the east, where moisture compacts some low surfaces and vegetation holds old tracks. We checked every green patch for broken stems or discarded gear. We found litter from another visitor, and a line of old elk tracks. We found no Gabriel and no Claire. On our return, one orange marking wand leaned beside the covered tent. When I pulled it free, the lower half had been polished smooth. Its printed measurements were gone. The plastic looked heat-softened, although it felt cold. We withdrew before lightning reached the open dune field. The walkout took longer than the approach because every team had to remain accounted for, and 2 searchers showed early signs of heat stress. Wind met us on the first high ridge. It came from the southwest, the ordinary prevailing direction, and lifted dry grains in pale ribbons around our ankles. Behind us, the campsite marker disappeared below the crest. The first boom came from that direction. It was deeper than the small slide Jonah and I had triggered. The note rolled through the ridge beneath us and continued long enough to become pressure in my chest. A second note answered from a dune to the north. Then a third sounded farther east. Natural booming can travel, and one avalanche may coincide with another under changing wind. What happened next was not natural. The ridge directly ahead of us began to vibrate before any sand moved on its face. The vibration arrived from below, passed under our boots, and continued toward the valley. A shallow groove opened across the slope. It was roughly the width of a person's shoulders. As the groove traveled, its sides rose into low ridges. For several seconds, I could see the impression of something moving beneath the sand, without disturbing the surface above it. The shape stopped beneath the footprint of the last searcher in our line. The print deepened. I ordered everyone off the lee side and onto the wind-packed ridge. The words came out sharper than I intended. No one argued. We climbed until the wind struck us full in the face and erased our own tracks as soon as we made them. Behind us, the isolated footprint continued sinking. It went down past the depth of an ankle, then a calf, then collapsed inward without leaving a hole. By the time we reached the parking area, the official explanation had already begun forming. Unstable dune face. Subsurface voids. Complex wind loading after a storm. Search personnel affected by heat, altitude, and expectation. I used those phrases myself because they kept the incident manageable. They also kept people from making the worst possible decision, which would have been rushing back into the same basin without understanding what the ground was doing. That evening, while lightning flickered over the mountains, I reviewed the phone photograph on a large monitor. The tent looked ordinary. Gabriel's boot stood near the entrance. Claire's partial shadow crossed the corner. There was another shadow on the slip face behind them. It had no person attached to it. It rose from the sand in a narrow upright column, darker at the bottom, and almost transparent near the shoulders. Its head reached above the crest, but nothing interrupted the sky. The photograph did not prove what it seemed to prove. Digital images create artifacts. Wide-angle lenses stretch edges. Fine textures confuse compression. A fold in the slip face may appear darker than the slope around it, and the human brain is aggressive about turning vague forms into bodies. I sent the original file to our evidence technician without describing what I thought I saw. She confirmed that the image had not been edited after capture. She also found nothing in the dark shape that could not be explained as shadow and wind-scoured sand. The missing pair remained the priority. We closed the backcountry permit zone, posted staff at access points, and requested a helicopter search. Crews examined the outer sand sheet, Medano Creek, the mountain edge, and routes toward the road. Nothing suggested that Gabriel and Claire had left voluntarily. Their families supplied dental records and descriptions of old injuries in case the search became a recovery. I hated that part of missing person work. It reduces a life to durable features before anyone is willing to say the person is dead. Wah. The storm system moved out overnight. The following morning was clear and almost windless. From the air, the dunes looked frozen. Long shadows gave every ridge a sharp outline. The helicopter crew saw our marker near the campsite and several pieces of gear exposed along the adjacent slope. They saw no people. Infrared imaging produced little useful information because sunlit and shaded surfaces changed temperature too quickly. One cool, vertical patch near the tent attracted attention, but it disappeared when the aircraft circled for another angle. We returned on foot with a smaller technical group. Dr. Taryn Wells, a geomorphologist who had worked on dune monitoring projects, joined us. Taryn was not employed by the park full-time, but she knew the system better than anyone available on short notice. She brought ground temperature probes, density samplers, and a portable device used to measure layers without excavating large sections. Before leaving the developed area, she listened to my account and removed every word that implied intention. A groove had propagated through sand. A footprint had subsided. Vibrations had continued after visible grain flow ended. That was the language she accepted. The route to the campsite had changed. This was expected. Small ridges migrate constantly, and the previous day's wind had rebuilt exposed surfaces. We followed GPS coordinates and major forms rather than our old tracks. Near the second ridge, Taryn stopped to compare the faces. The southwest wind had driven grains up the gentle windward slope and deposited them over the crest. The northeast side held a fresh slip face with loose, dry layers. She showed me how the ripple marks ended at the ridge, and how the sheltered sand below lacked the hard skin found on the windward side. None of this was new to me, but her precision mattered. We were identifying the conditions associated with the movement we had seen. The campsite was no longer where we had left it. The coordinates placed us on a newly cut saddle. Our reflective marker lay flat beneath less than an inch of sand. The tent, pack, and empty boot were gone. A storm can move or bury exposed gear, but the wind after our departure had blown from the southwest. Based on the new shape of the ridge, loose material should have traveled northeast and accumulated below the opposite face. We searched that direction first. Nothing appeared on the surface. Probing located compacted layers, but no tent poles. We widened the grid. After an hour, one team found Gabriel's cooking pot almost 100 yards southwest, against the expected movement. It stood upright on an exposed shoulder. The lid remained clipped in place. Taryn sampled the sand beneath it. The upper layers showed ordinary wind deposition. 5 inches down, the probe entered a band much denser than the material above or below. The band angled uphill. It was only a few inches thick, and extended beyond the reach of our excavation. When she pushed a metal rod into it, a tremor passed through the handle. We all stepped away. The surface remained still. We mapped the dense band from multiple points. It curved through the dune like a buried ribbon. In some places it was too deep to reach. In others it came within a foot of the surface. The line connected the cooking pot to the former campsite, then continued north toward a steep lee face. The material inside the band was dry, but its grains were packed so closely that the sampler brought up a coherent cylinder. Under magnification, the grains were not cemented by clay or salts. They separated when touched. Pressure alone had locked them together. At the lee face, the band divided. One branch ran downward with the slope. The other turned upward against gravity and ended beneath a shallow depression shaped like 2 knees and a hand. Claire's pack lay several feet beyond it. The fabric had not torn. Both shoulder straps were adjusted to her size. One side pocket contained sunglasses. The main compartment held clothing, a water filter, and a paper map. Her boots were not with it. The map contained pencil notes written before the trip. Claire had marked possible camping basins and water considerations. On the back, in a different pressure and much darker graphite, someone had drawn a sequence of curved lines. At first the marks resembled dune ridges. Taryn rotated the page. The lines became a cross-section. A thin band entered from the lower left, divided under 3 upright forms, and continued uphill. Beside the last form were 4 words in block letters. "It moves when they sing." No one recognized the handwriting. Gabriel's family later said it was not his. Claire's family said the same. The paper showed no water damage and the pack had been zipped. We photographed the message and sealed the map as evidence. I tried to interpret it as a note Claire had copied from a sign, a ranger talk, or a geology article. Sand does move during booming avalanches. The statement could have been a simple observation. The drawing was harder to dismiss because it matched the compacted band under our feet. Taryn triggered a controlled slide on an isolated section of the lee face. She used a pole from the crest while the rest of us stood on firm windward sand. A narrow sheet released and produced a low hum. The sound remained ordinary for the first few seconds. Then the dense band beneath the surface answered. The response was lower, almost below hearing. My teeth pressed together without my deciding to do it. The metal sampler beside Taryn began to tremble. The compacted ribbon moved uphill by nearly 3 feet. We verified it with marked probes. There was no surface displacement. The grains inside the dune had tightened in one section and loosened behind it, transferring a stable shape through otherwise unstable material. Taryn compared it to a stress wave, though she said she knew of no process that could preserve a narrow band over that distance or direct it against the slope. The movement ended beneath one of our orange wands. The wand sank until only the flag remained visible. We pulled it out from the side. The lower plastic had been polished smooth exactly like the marker from the previous day. This time there was a shallow groove running around it, as if the sand had tightened and rotated under pressure. Taryn packed her instruments without further debate. We had enough information to justify a broader closure and a new search strategy. We would avoid active slip faces, travel on windward slopes and interdunal flats, and stop deliberately triggering booming sand. Aviation and perimeter teams could continue while we reassessed the interior. Before leaving, I looked back at the depression near Claire's pack. The marks of 2 knees and 1 hand had softened in the breeze. A 4th indentation appeared while I watched. 5 narrow grooves pressed into the surface one after another, forming the outline of a 2nd hand. The fingers pointed uphill. The dune boomed somewhere beyond the next ridge. The new handprint closed into a fist. The closure remained in effect while the search continued around it. That distinction mattered to the families and to us. We were not abandoning Gabriel and Claire. We were changing how we looked for them. Teams worked the edges of the Dunnafield, the creek corridors, and the mountain approaches. Aircraft searched when wind allowed. Rangers contacted every visitor who had held an overnight permit during the same period and reviewed photographs for background figures, lights, or gear. We placed observers with long lenses on high points outside the restricted basin. For nearly 2 days, none of them saw movement. The dunes also stopped booming. Wind crossed the surface in weak afternoon gusts, but no large slip faces released. Taryn installed passive markers along the wind-packed sides of several ridges and small acoustic sensors on firm interdunal ground. We did not insert anything into the compacted ribbon. The instruments recorded ordinary wind noise, aircraft, distant thunder, and the footsteps of authorized searchers. The low response we had felt did not return. By Wednesday afternoon, some people believed the danger had passed with the storm. I wanted to believe that too. A temporary condition was easier to manage than a place that could decide when to become dangerous. Shortly before sunset, an observer on the southern edge reported 2 figures near the northern Star Dune complex. They were more than a mile from the original campsite and visible only when the light struck a particular slope. One appeared to be standing. The other was lower, possibly kneeling or waving. The observer watched through a spotting scope, while the incident lead called for confirmation from the helicopter. The figures disappeared behind a ridge before the aircraft could launch. If Gabriel and Claire had survived several days, they would be dehydrated, exhausted, and unable to move efficiently. Night temperatures would fall into the 40s. The forecast promised light southwest wind until morning. A ground team could reach the sighting before dark and shelter with them if evacuation was unsafe. Waiting protected searchers. Going protected the missing pair. Search work is full of decisions where safety belongs to different people on opposite sides of the equation. Jonah and I took the forward assignment because we knew the interior route and the suspected mechanism. 2 additional rangers followed on a parallel ridge with medical equipment, keeping enough distance that one unstable face could not affect all 4 of us. Taryn remained at the command post, monitoring the acoustic sensors and wind readings. We agreed on strict rules. We would travel only on firm windward slopes or low, compacted flats. We would not descend a fresh slipface, even for visible gear. If booming began nearby, everyone would stop on the safest available surface until we understood its direction. If wind reversed strongly from the mountains, we would withdraw. The air cooled rapidly after the sun touched the San Juan Mountains. Heat left the grains, and the dry smell of the day became mineral and faintly bitter. Each ridge opened onto blue shadow below. I scanned for movement and found only the slow migration of darkness. We reached the observers bearing near dusk. From the final crest, I saw one of them. A person stood halfway down the opposite face wearing a light-colored jacket. The head was bent. One arm extended toward the slope as if for balance. I raised my binoculars and recognized Claire's blue rain shell from her permit photograph. I called her name once. The figure did not move. I called again and identified us as rangers. Nothing changed. The distance was less than 200 yards, close enough that she should have heard me in the calm air. Jonah examined the slope between us. The direct line crossed a broadleaf face with fresh, loose sand. We moved around the basin instead, staying on the older wind-packed arm of the star dune. The detour took nearly 20 minutes. During that time, the figure remained in exactly the same posture. It was not Claire. Her jacket had been filled with compacted sand from the waist upward. The hood contained a smooth oval with no features. One sleeve extended because the sand inside it connected to the slope. Below the waist, the jacket entered the dune without legs. The surface around it showed no tracks. A few feet away stood a second narrow column wearing Gabriel's backpack. Its straps were buckled across a chest made of sand. We did not step closer. Jonah marked the location from firm ground while I informed command that the sighting was gear, not survivors. The parallel team was still several ridges south and began moving toward us. Taryn asked whether we had heard any acoustic activity. I told her no. As I answered, the light southwest wind stopped. The silence lasted perhaps 30 seconds. The sand blowing from the crest fell straight down. Cold air settled into the basin and touched the sweat at the back of my neck. Then, a northeast wind came off the mountains. It arrived as a low wall. I saw it strike the far ridge before I felt it. Sand lifted from the crest and streamed toward us in a white sheet. The wind hit my face hard enough to make me turn. In seconds, the gentle side on which we stood began losing grains. The safe windward surface was becoming the sheltered side of a reversing dune. The sharp crest softened, rolled backward, and formed a new edge behind us. Taryn's voice came over the radio, warning that the mountain station had recorded a sudden outflow far stronger than forecast. Her next words vanished beneath the first boom. The sound began inside the slope holding Claire's jacket. The sand-filled torso sagged as the face released around it. Instead of falling with the avalanche, the jacket rose. It lifted several inches, carried by a column that tightened beneath it. The hood rotated toward us. There was still no face inside, only packed darkness where the opening should have been. A second dune boomed to our south. A third answered near the original campsite. The notes overlapped until the basin vibrated continuously. My radio housing buzzed against my vest. Sand flowed over my boots from the new crest. We moved at once, angling toward the side that the northeast wind was striking directly. The route we had used to approach was now the wrong side of every reversing ridge. The compacted band surfaced behind us. It appeared as a dark seam no wider than my hand, running beneath the loose upper layer. Each time a nearby slipface released and boomed, the seam advanced. It did not follow our footprints. Northeast wind erased those almost immediately. It moved from one avalanche to the next, crossing the saddle through places where the vibration was strongest. Where two notes overlapped, the seam divided. Jonah saw one branch cutting toward the parallel team and redirected them by radio. They climbed onto a narrow windward spur. The other branch reached the base of our ridge. A section of sand below my right foot compacted so abruptly that the surface dropped. I stepped forward and felt the heel of my boot catch. The grains around it had become firm as set plaster. I pulled upward. The boot moved less than an inch. Jonah clipped a short rescue webbing loop to my pack belt and braced on the windward side. We had trained to avoid tying ourselves together on unstable slopes, but he did not anchor me to him. He used the loop only to add a steady pull while I twisted my foot. The next booming pulse passed under us. The pressure around my ankle climbed. It did not feel like sand collapsing. It felt like a hand closing through several layers of clothing. I released the laces using the quick hook at the top of the boot. Jonah pulled as I drove my knee forward. My heel came free. The boot remained upright, buried to the ankle and pointed toward the mountains. For one absurd second, I thought of the first boot we had found. I understood why it had been tied. Gabriel had not removed it. Something had packed the sand around him so tightly that only his foot had escaped, leaving the boot in place. The booming deepened. Sand rose inside my empty boot. It filled the ankle, lifted the tongue, and held the shape of a foot that was no longer there. We climbed. Moving uphill on sand with one bare foot was slow and painful. The grains had cooled, but every buried stone and clump of magnetite pressed through my sock. Jonah stayed slightly below me without stepping onto the developing lee face. Wind drove sand against the side of my head and filled my collar. We kept our weight on the slope facing the new wind, where grains were being stripped away rather than deposited. That surface was uncomfortable but firm. More importantly, it did not boom. The parallel team could not reach us without crossing an active bowl. I ordered them to withdraw along their own safe line. One ranger protested because I was injured. I repeated the order. Bringing 4 people together would only give the moving bands more routes through connected slipfaces. We all knew how to reach the eastern edge. We would meet on wet ground. Darkness closed before we cleared the Star Dune complex. We switched our headlamps to narrow beams and kept them aimed at the surface immediately ahead. Using distant light would have flattened the slopes and hidden the texture that told us which face was stable. Windward sand showed moving ripples and a thin crust broken by our steps. Lee sand looked smooth, soft, and slightly darker. Every time a ridge reversed, those signs changed. We checked them with our poles before committing weight. The compacted seams moved around us. One pushed 3 upright bulges through a slipface to our left. Another surfaced carrying the orange flag from the campsite. The polished wand leaned forward, disappeared during silence, then rose when the next dune boomed. None of the shapes crossed the windward crust. They stopped at each crest, as though the moving grains required shelter. That observation became our route. We followed the wind instead of the shortest path out, staying on slopes the gusts struck directly. When the flow weakened or reversed, we crossed crests before new slipfaces formed. We moved slowly enough to read the dunes and quickly enough to avoid the next change. Below one saddle, we found a line of objects standing in the sand. 2 trekking poles. A rusted steel canteen. A camera on a collapsed tripod. A child's red plastic shovel faded almost white. None belonged to Gabriel or Claire. Some were recent. Others looked decades old. Each had been placed vertically along a compacted band that disappeared beneath the next dune. The camera body was open, and its film had fused into a hard black curl. The canteen cap was still screwed on. When Jonah touched it with his pole, the container produced the same low note as the booming sand. We left everything where it stood. Near midnight, the wind settled into a steady northeast flow. That should have made navigation easier. Instead, long lee faces began releasing one after another across the southern half of the Dunnafield. The sound became almost continuous. It was not loud in the way thunder is loud. It was too low for that. I felt it in my ribs, my teeth, and the bones around my eyes. Each note seemed to remove air from the basin. Breathing required deliberate effort. My thoughts narrowed to surface texture, compass bearing, and the next stable place for my foot. The final high ridge above Medano Creek was the steepest. Its eastern face had been scoured by the mountain wind and remained firm. The western face, leading toward the creek, was sheltered and actively rebuilding. Our destination lay below the dangerous side. We could not simply walk downhill. Every small step would trigger a slide, and every slide would give the compacted bands another path. Jonah proposed following the crest north until the slope flattened. That route added distance but kept us on firm ground. We began the traverse. Halfway across, the wind dropped again. Grains stopped striking my jacket. The new silence was more frightening than the booming because I knew a reversal could arrive from either direction. Beneath the western face, upright columns began to rise. There were more than a dozen. Some were short and incomplete. Others reached the height of adults. One wore Claire's jacket. Another carried Gabriel's pack. The rest were bare sand with faint indentations where shoulders and heads should have been. They did not walk. The dense bands transferred pressure through the slope, collapsing one column and raising the next several feet higher. From the crest, the effect resembled a line of people climbing without moving their limbs. The southwest wind returned. It struck our backs. The firm face beneath us became the future lee side, and the new slip face began forming exactly where we stood. We had less than a minute before enough loose sand accumulated to release. The direct descent toward the creek was now on the windward side. We crossed the crest as it rolled beneath our boots and descended into the southwest wind. Sand struck our faces and moved around our ankles, but the surface stayed hard. Behind us, the old face collapsed with a single enormous boom. The vibration overtook us halfway down. A compacted seam formed to my left, then failed when the wind stripped away the loose grains above it. A second reached Jonah's track and broke apart before it could tighten. The force beneath the dune required a sheltered layer. Exposed to direct wind, it could not hold its shape. We continued downhill until sand gave way to the dry-looking creek bed. I tested it with my pole. The upper crust cracked, exposing darker material beneath. Moisture touched the tip. We stepped onto it and kept moving east toward the thin remaining flow. The last compacted band followed us to the edge. It raised a narrow ridge behind my footprints and stopped where the damp sand began. A low note traveled through it. The note weakened, divided into smaller vibrations, and vanished beneath the sound of shallow water moving over the creek bed. Jonah and I did not stop until we were standing ankle-deep in Medano Creek near Castle Creek. The water was cold enough to hurt. My sock had torn, and blood from several small cuts clouded around my foot before the current carried it away. Behind us, the dunes continued booming in the dark. Nothing crossed the wet sand. The parallel team reached the creek nearly an hour later. They had stayed on windward ridges and emerged farther south without injury. A vehicle met us on the primitive road after the wind fell enough for safe travel. By then my foot was swollen, Jonah's eyes were inflamed from blowing sand, and every piece of our equipment held grit. Neither of us had a life-threatening injury. That fact made the next several hours feel strangely ordinary. A medic cleaned my cuts. Someone handed me a paper cup of coffee. I gave a recorded statement while wrapped in a blanket and watched dawn turn the dunes gold through a vehicle window. Terran's sensors documented the night. The acoustic record showed widespread booming beginning shortly after the northeast outflow reached the park. That part matched known dune behavior. The anomalies lay in the sequence. Several sensors recorded low vibrations arriving before nearby surface avalanches, not after them. The events moved from the original campsite toward our search area, then progressed east at roughly the pace of two people traveling on foot. The final signal reached the sensor closest to Medano Creek, just before Jonah and I stepped onto the wet bed. It remained there for 6 minutes, then dispersed into background noise. The data did not prove that something had pursued us. It proved that a stress pattern moved through dry sand, in a sequence no one could explain. Terran copied the raw files to separate drives and wrote a technical summary limited to observation. She refused to use the word entity. So did I. Names create the illusion that a thing has been understood. The interior search did not resume immediately. We kept the closure in place through another wind cycle and worked from the air and perimeter. When teams returned under calm conditions, the campsite basin had changed again. The upright jacket backpack, old canteen, camera, poles, and orange wand were no longer exposed. The reason was visible and ordinary. The reversing wind had cut several feet from one face and deposited it on another. Anything left on the slope had been buried or moved. We did not claim that evidence had vanished from a locked room. It had disappeared inside a system capable of relocating tons of sand overnight. The missing backpackers were never found. Searchers located one of Claire's gloves near the eastern creek edge, and Gabriel's empty water bottle on the sand sheet west of the main dunes. Neither item gave us a reliable direction because wind could have carried both. No remains surfaced. No confirmed tracks left the interior. The official conclusion remained open, with exposure, disorientation, and accidental burial listed among the strongest possibilities. Their families were told about the unusual campsite condition and the hazards created by storm-driven dune movement. They were not shown Claire's sand-filled jacket. By the time anyone could have recovered it, its location was beneath a new ridge. My boot was missing too. We had marked its coordinates during our withdrawal, but the ridge reversed completely. Weeks later, a ranger found a boot matching its description near the original campsite, more than a mile from where I had lost it. The laces were tied. My identification mark remained beneath the tongue. The leather showed no damage. The inside was packed with cold sand in the shape of a foot. I asked the evidence technician to leave it intact. Terran scanned it before we cut the leather. The sand plug included the arch, individual toes, and the shallow ridge left by a sock seam. It matched my right foot closely enough that a medical examiner could compare the two. There was even a narrow gap where an old scar crosses my heel. No one could explain how loose grains had recorded a feature hidden beneath fabric and leather. When the boot was opened, the sand lost cohesion at once. It poured onto the examination table like any other dry sample. Mixed with it were several orange plastic shavings from a polished search wand and one small brass buckle. The buckle came from Claire Suttondoe's pack. The raw acoustic files were preserved, but the portable instruments did not remain useful. Fine sand had entered their sealed housings and abraded several internal components. That can happen in a dune environment. Terran's independent copies remained readable. Months later, when she prepared the data for review, the low-frequency track contained 2 repeated patterns, not visible in the field graphs. One matched the spacing of the steps Jonah and I recorded on our GPS route. The other was shorter and irregular. It began near the campsite, joined our path during the wind reversal, and ended at Medano Creek. It contained 2 more intervals than ours. After the active search ended, I reviewed older incident files for anything involving unusual burial, upright gear, or sound. Most reports were ordinary. Wind had buried tents, exposed abandoned property, and erased roots. Visitors had become separated in storms and followed the wrong ridge for hours. People described booming sand as engines, aircraft, thunder, or voices beneath the ground. Those records did not need supernatural explanations. The dunes are fully capable of frightening people while behaving exactly as dunes should. One file was different. In the autumn of 1968, 3 college students entered the dunes to photograph a meteor shower. 2 returned before sunrise. They said the 3rd student, a man named Peter Lowell, had walked behind a ridge to retrieve a tripod and never came back. A search found the tripod standing upright on a slipface with all 3 legs folded. One of Peter's shoes was buried nearby. It was still laced and empty. The report attributed the condition to wind and noted that searchers heard prolonged booming during recovery operations. Peter Lowell was not found. A handwritten page had been clipped behind the formal report. It belonged to a ranger named Samuel Price. He wrote that the search team discovered several narrow cavities beneath the shoe. Probes entered more than 5 feet. The cavities closed from below after the probes were removed. Samuel recommended that teams remain on windward faces during booming events and use wet creek beds for withdrawal. His recommendation did not appear in later operational guidance, probably because the observation could not be reproduced, and the report offered no accepted mechanism. The last sentence was underlined twice. Do not follow the standing shapes. They are not the missing person. Samuel had died years before I joined the park. I located his daughter, who still lived in the valley. She remembered that her father refused to take the family onto the dunes after storms. He would walk beside Medano Creek and stop at the first dry ridge. When the sand boomed, he counted the people visible on the slopes. He never explained why. Before ending our call, she told me he had kept one object from the Lowell search in a box beneath his workbench. It was an orange plastic marker polished smooth on its lower half. No new rule was added to public science because of our case. We did not tell visitors that something lived in the dunes. We emphasized dangers that could be defended with evidence: lightning, heat, rapid weather changes, difficult navigation, unstable slip faces, and the need for enough water and warm layers. Internally, several of us changed how we approached backcountry searches after strong reversing winds. We avoided gathering teams below active crests. We marked routes from firm ground. When booming began, we moved toward windward faces and kept Medano Creek in mind as a boundary, even when it appeared dry. I transferred to another park 2 years later. The decision was not dramatic. My husband had accepted work farther north, and I was ready for a position with fewer emergency callouts. I did not resign, and I did not stop entering wild places. Fear did not take the rest of my career. It changed one habit. Whenever I return to great sand dunes, I count people. I stand near the creek or on the first firm ridge and count the visitors climbing against the sky. I count again when they descend. Usually the numbers differ for simple reasons. A family sits below a crest. A child runs ahead. A couple crosses into another bowl. The Dunnifield hides and reveals people with every step. The last time I visited was in early September, on a clear evening after a day of strong wind. The creek was only a shallow ribbon along the eastern edge. Stars appeared over the mountains, and the sand cooled beneath my boots. A group of 11 hikers stood along a high ridge watching the remaining light fade from the valley. I counted them because I always do. The first person descended. Then, the second. Sand slid beneath their heels and began to hum. One by one, the others followed, dark shapes crossing the pale face. I counted 11 people reach the bottom. The booming continued after they had stopped. Halfway up the empty slip face, a 12th shape rose from beneath the sand. It had no clothing and no features. It stood upright while grains moved through it, as though the dune were remembering the space a person had occupied. No one in the group turned around. They walked toward the parking area, laughing softly, their headlamps still off beneath the stars. The shape remained until the note faded. Then it collapsed downhill, and a narrow dark seam moved back toward the interior. I stayed on the wet sand until the dunes became quiet. An avalanche transceiver does not sound frightened. That is one reason rescuers learn to trust it. The tone is electronic, repetitive, and stripped of emotion. It becomes faster as you approach a buried transmitter and slower when you move away. During training, that rhythm gives you something clean to follow while instructors shout, "Wind drives snow across the search strip," and every part of your body insists that you are taking too long. You learn to ignore panic. You watch the distance fall on the screen. Slow your steps, lower the receiver near the snow, and let a machine reduce a human life to direction and numbers. I used to find comfort in that simplicity. I have not carried a transceiver with the sound enabled for 6 years. My name is Grant Keller. I worked 11 seasons as a climbing ranger at Mount Rainier National Park, most of them on the east side of the mountain. Visitors sometimes imagine that the job consisted of standing at a high camp and giving weather advice to climbers. We did plenty of that, but we also registered parties, checked routes, documented wilderness impacts, removed abandoned equipment, treated injuries, and trained for the emergencies that the mountain eventually provided. Every climbing ranger I respected treated routine patrols as preparation. You stayed fit, learned how the glaciers changed, practiced rope systems until cold hands could build them without hesitation, and paid attention when a route that had been safe the week before began to break apart. Mount Rainier is not a fixed mountain with ice lying on top of it. The ice moves. Snow accumulates high on the volcano, compresses into firn, and becomes glacier ice under the weight of the layers above. That mass flows downhill, faster at the surface than at the bed. Where the slope or speed changes, the ice stretches and opens into crevasses. Where separate cracks intersect, blocks and towers form. Lower down, rock debris can hide blue ice so completely that a visitor believes they are walking on an ordinary moraine. Meltwater travels through channels that enlarge, collapse, and move from one season to the next. A route is never safe because it was safe last year. It is safe only to the extent that the conditions in front of you can be read correctly. The incident began during an early summer training patrol above Glacier Basin. We had walked in from the White River side before sunrise, following the old trail beside the Interfork and climbing beyond the maintained path toward the Interglacier. It was the kind of morning that makes poor decisions feel reasonable. The sky was clear over Little Tahoma. The snow surface had frozen hard overnight, and every crampon point made a dry crunch that carried across the basin. The air smelled of sun-warmed stone near the lower ridge, but on the glacier it had almost no smell at all. Cold pressed into the gaps around my goggles. When the sun cleared the ridge, heat touched one side of my face while the other remained numb. I was working with Nina Alvarez, another climbing ranger, and our field supervisor, Eric Baines. Nina had spent 4 seasons at Rainier and 2 more doing ski patrol work in Utah. She was methodical without being slow, which is one of the best qualities a rescuer can have. Eric had placed 2 training transceivers inside padded bags before burying them in separate snow pits. Nina and I had kept our backs turned while he prepared the field. The exercise was ordinary. We would perform a signal search, separate the overlapping transmissions, complete a fine search, probe, and dig. Afterward, we would switch roles and complicate the next round. I found the first unit quickly. Its signal led me across a shallow apron below a windroll, then tightened until the screen showed less than a meter. I bracketed the lowest reading, marked it with a glove, and began probing in a spiral. The probe struck the padded bag at about chest depth. Nina was already isolating the second signal 50 yards uphill. I left my probe standing, reset my receiver, and moved to assist her. That was when a third transmission appeared. At first I assumed I was seeing Nina's buried unit. Multiple signal indicators are useful, but close transmitters can produce confusing readings, especially during a hurried search. I moved across the slope to create separation. Nina's signal remained uphill. The other stayed behind my right shoulder. When I turned toward it, the display showed a distance in the high 30s and began to fall. I asked Eric how many units he had buried. He held up 2 fingers. We stopped the exercise and accounted for our equipment. Eric uncovered both training bags and switched the transmitters off. Nina changed her receiver from search to send, then back again. I did the same. The third signal remained. Its pulse was stable and clean. It did not flutter like electrical interference or appear only at one orientation. The arrow pointed down Glacier toward a flat section of seasonal snow near the edge of the exposed ice. Another team could have been traveling below us, but we had seen no one since leaving Glacier Basin. A person wearing a transmitting beacon on a switch-backing route can seem to move unpredictably as terrain changes. This signal did not move. It waited in the same direction while I traversed 20 yards left and right. The screen distance changed exactly as it should have. Somewhere beneath or beyond that flat snow, a transmitter was sending on the standard rescue frequency. We treated it as a real search. That decision was not dramatic. People lose equipment, practice alone, or make choices they do not put on a permit. A buried pack can transmit long after its owner has walked away, and an injured traveler may be unable to answer a radio or voice call. Eric notified dispatch while Nina and I moved down the glacier in a controlled search line. We called out at intervals. Our voices came back from the rock walls, thin and delayed. No one answered. The distance fell from the 30s into the 20s. The snow surface ahead looked undisturbed except for old melt channels frozen into gray curves. There were no boot prints, ski tracks, or recent debris. Near a low ice bulge, the arrow began to rotate. I slowed and lowered the receiver. The reading dropped below 10 meters, then below 5 to 20. Nina moved away to prevent her equipment from confusing mine. I followed the flux line across a patch of hard blue ice lightly covered with wind-blown snow. At the lowest point, the display showed 3.2 meters. I stepped over it. The number increased. I returned and approached from 4 directions. Each line converged on the same place. We scraped away the thin snow and found solid glacier ice. It was pale blue beneath the scratched surface, without a crack wide enough to accept a probe. I extended a 3-meter avalanche probe and pushed it into 2 narrow melt holes nearby. Both ended in hard ice before half the shaft disappeared. Nina checked with her receiver. She found the same minimum within inches of mine. Eric brought a 3rd unit from the training cache and repeated the search. 3 receivers from 2 manufacturers agreed that a transmitting beacon sat approximately 3 meters below an unbroken sheet of glacier ice. The normal explanation was that the signal traveled through a hidden crevasse and our distance readings were distorted by the transmitter's orientation. Radio fields are not measuring tapes. Burial angle, interference, and antenna alignment can mislead a searcher. What mattered was whether a person might be below. We inspected the surrounding surface for an opening, a collapsed bridge, a dropped glove, a rope groove, anything that suggested an accident. We found none. The ice was dense enough that old grit formed dark bands within it. Air bubbles caught the sun like tiny pieces of metal. A few feet from the search point, a narrow line of bubbles curved down into the glacier and vanished. Eric called the position in and checked current registrations. No climbing party was overdue. No solo permit placed anyone on that part of the route. The few teams above us had checked in from Camp Sherman or were visible on the Glacier. We spent another hour searching the perimeter and listening at every opening we could safely approach. The signal never weakened, never changed interval, and never responded when we switched a training unit on beside it. Then, shortly after the sun reached the ice, it stopped. There was no fading and no battery warning. One pulse appeared on my screen, and the next did not. Nina's receiver went silent at the same instant. We waited through several cycles, moved outward, and searched the entire band again. Nothing returned. We marked the position on the GPS and placed a wand well away from the center so we could recognize the area without creating a false route marker. Eric photographed the surface and wrote the anomaly into the patrol log. We packed the training equipment and continued uphill. By then, the snow had softened. Water ticked beneath crusts along the rock, and small grains of ice whispered down the sun-facing slope. The mountain had resumed all its familiar sounds. I remember looking back once before the ice bulge disappeared below us. The wand stood upright against the white. Its black flag moved in the wind. The glacier beneath it moved the other way. I did not see the ice flow. No human eye can watch a glacier advance from one second to the next. What I saw was the wand lean downhill, straighten, and then lean uphill against the wind as something pulled its buried end from below. It stayed that way for several seconds. Then the lower foot of the shaft vanished cleanly into solid ice. We returned to the marker that afternoon. Sun had softened the seasonal snow but had not produced enough melt to open a hole around the wand. The shaft entered the glacier through a round opening no wider than the plastic itself. I knelt beside it and pulled. It did not move. Nina clipped a sling around the exposed section and applied steady force while I watched the ice for cracking. The wand came free so suddenly that she sat backward in the snow. The lower end had not broken. It had been cut smooth on a shallow diagonal. The hollow fiberglass shaft was pinched closed as if it had passed through something hot, although the surface was cold and dry. Eric took the wand for the equipment file. We searched again with all three receivers. There was no signal. Back at the White River station, ordinary work pushed the anomaly aside. A climber arrived with a hand injury from a crampon point. 2 permit parties changed routes after weather moved into the upper mountain. A report came in about abandoned food and human waste near a bivouac site, and I spent part of the evening documenting it. Strange details lose force inside paperwork. Once they are reduced to a time, a coordinate, and a description written to survive review, they begin to look manageable. Eric's report used the phrase unidentified transmission beneath glacier surface. He listed likely causes in descending order: lost equipment in a covered crevasse, signal distortion from a transmitter elsewhere on the slope, unregistered travelers, receiver interference, and training error. He added the cut wand as a separate equipment damage note. None of us objected. We had no missing person, and no evidence that demanded an extraordinary conclusion. The equipment did not support interference. We replaced every battery, ran function tests, and compared the receivers outside the station. They behaved normally. Eric contacted the climbing team at Camp Sherman and asked whether anyone had reported losing a beacon during the approach. No one had. The guides checked their caches and group equipment. Everything was accounted for. I expected that to be the end of it. The mountain contains more lost gear than most visitors would believe. Ice preserves objects, moves them, and releases them far from where they entered. A transmitter could have been carried inside a crevasse and covered by later snow. The battery life was difficult to explain, but not impossible if the unit had been lost recently, and the registration gap had some harmless cause. I did not need the exact owner to accept that a beacon might be under the ice. What bothered me was the direction of the wand. Glacier ice under pressure can close around an object. Surface melt can open a channel. Neither process should have drawn a shaft into intact ice in less than an hour and sealed the entrance behind it. I kept seeing the clipped lower end and remembering the way the flag had leaned uphill. That night, while rain tapped the metal roof above the station, I searched old patrol logs. Climbing records are full of language that conceals fear without intending to. A ranger may write that a party became disoriented in poor visibility, that an unstable serac prevented access, or that a search was suspended because risk exceeded the probability of survival. Those phrases are necessary. They tell the next team what happened without forcing a report to carry every private detail. I was looking for a simple phrase: unidentified signal, stray beacon, false transmission. I found the first in a report from 9 seasons earlier. A guide had notified rangers of a rescue frequency signal near the lower interglacier. No party was missing. The signal had been detected by 2 clients during a practice session and disappeared before a ranger arrived. The guide believed a third party had crossed below the training area. There was no follow-up. The second report was older and came from a search for an overdue skier. A hasty team detected a transmitting beacon west of the expected route. They diverted toward it but lost the signal after approximately 15 minutes. The missing skier was later found alive in a snow shelter more than a mile away. He had not carried a transceiver. The report attributed the detection to another team in the area, although no other team was identified. I found 5 more references over a period of nearly 3 decades. The wording changed, but the pattern did not. A signal appeared on or near the interglacier. More than one receiver detected it. It remained stable long enough to begin a search, then stopped before the source was found. Most incidents occurred early in the season, when thick snow covered openings and cold nights alternated with warm, bright days. In 2 cases, a missing person response was underway. In the others, training had placed multiple receivers in search mode. One report contained a hand-drawn map, by D. The coordinate system was obsolete, but the terrain sketch was clear. I compared the ice edge, moraine, and slope angle with our GPS track. The marked signal lay below our point, consistent with normal glacier flow over the years. That made the lost equipment theory stronger. It also meant the transmitter would have been operating beneath the ice for at least 26 years. Nina found me shortly after midnight. She had been checking the same archive from a different terminal. In a maintenance attachment to the oldest report, she found a note about a damaged root wand. It had been placed near the search point and recovered the next day with its lower end compressed flat. We did not wake Eric. There was no emergency, only a coincidence old enough to make us uncomfortable. We printed the relevant pages and left them on his desk. Before going to the bunk room, I removed the battery from my receiver. That decision embarrassed me even while I made it. A powered-off transceiver in a station was not going to attract anything, interfere with anything, or begin transmitting by itself. At 3:17 that morning, every avalanche receiver in the equipment cabinet began to beep. The cabinet stood in a locked storage room at the rear of the station. Nina and I reached it from opposite ends of the hall. Eric came seconds later, still pulling on a fleece layer. The sound was not the slow battery warning used by our units. It was the search tone, accelerating and slowing in overlapping rhythms, as though the receivers were moving around multiple transmitters. Eric unlocked the door. The sound stopped before he opened it. We inspected the cabinet. All training units had been switched off after testing. My receiver still lacked a battery. The others showed no fault when powered on. A building electrical problem could not make different battery-operated devices produce coordinated search tones, but we checked outlets, chargers, radios, and the breaker panel anyway. Nothing was wrong. Inside my battery compartment, a line of water rested along the lower contact. It was clear and cold. When I touched it with a swab, it carried fine gray sediment like glacial flour. Eric closed the compartment and set the receiver on a towel. He told us to get some sleep. His tone was firm because supervisors sometimes have to lend normalcy to a room. We obeyed because exhaustion is a real hazard, and because none of us had a useful action to take before daylight. The next morning, Eric approved a return to the signal point. We would not excavate or enter unknown ice. Our purpose was to map the anomaly, test for external interference, and inspect the surrounding surface for a safe explanation. Weather was expected to deteriorate by late afternoon. We left early with rope, rescue hardware, probes, spare wands, and a small spectrum analyzer borrowed from Park Communications. The analyzer was not designed for avalanche rescue work, but it could confirm whether energy existed near the transceiver frequency without depending on the search software inside a beacon. The approach felt different only because I knew where to look. The lower forest was wet from the night rain. Huckleberry leaves held water, and the old trail smelled of cedar, soil, and cold mineral mud. Above the trees, cloud moved across the ridges in loose gray layers. The mountain appeared between them in pieces. White river water carried so much ground rock that it looked like diluted cement. Its steady noise followed us toward Glacier Basin and faded only when we climbed onto snow. Our wand was gone. We found the first day's GPS coordinate and searched a wide circle. There was no exposed shaft and no hole. The surface had not melted enough to erase it. We powered the receivers, one at a time. The signal returned immediately. It was not below our original point. The arrow led uphill. We followed it across roughly 200 yards of glacier. The distance decreased in a smooth, believable progression. Eric walked beside me with the analyzer and watched a narrow peak rise at the expected frequency. This was not a display error. Something was transmitting through the ice. The new minimum lay beneath a shallow trough filled with drifted snow. My receiver showed a burial depth of approximately 4 meters. Nina approached from the opposite direction and reached the same point. We probed without result. Then Eric took 3 slow steps backward. His reading fell. Mine also fell, although I had not moved. The number changed from 4.1 to 3.6. Nina called out her own reading. It was dropping at the same rate. We stood still and watched the displays count down by tenths. At 2 meters, the ice beneath us made a sound like a distant door closing. We moved apart and clipped into the rope. The surface remained intact. No crack appeared, but a dull pressure traveled through the soles of my boots. My receiver showed 1.4 meters, then 1.2. The direction arrow spun once and pointed straight down. Eric switched his unit off. Nina did the same. I watched one final pulse cross my screen before I killed mine. Silence returned. Wind brushed loose snow along the trough. Beneath that, I heard a faint sequence of hard taps. They were separated by intervals of almost exactly 1 second. The taps moved from the center of the trough toward Nina. We retreated on the rope without turning our backs on the depression. The tapping followed below the ice, steady and unhurried. Nina reached the uphill edge first. When she stepped onto exposed blue ice, the sound stopped beneath her. A white line opened in the trough where we had been standing. It was no wider than a bootlace at first. Then the two sides pulled apart. The crevasse did not open across the glacier, as tension cracks normally do. It opened lengthwise along our retreat path. At the bottom of the narrow blue slot, something flashed red. I thought it was fabric until it flashed again at a precise interval. It was the status light of an avalanche beacon. The opening was less than a foot wide and narrowed again within minutes. We never approached the lip without protection. Eric built an anchor on solid ice while Nina and I probed the edges and inspected the visible walls. The red light continued to pulse about 12 feet below the surface. Through the slot I could see part of a black housing and a torn strap. The unit appeared older than any model we carried, though distortion in the blue ice made its shape difficult to judge. It was not lying in an open crevasse. It was enclosed behind a clear wall several inches thick. I lowered a camera on a pole. Condensation clouded the lens almost immediately, but several images showed enough detail to confirm what we had seen. The object had a rotary control and an external antenna folded along one side. It looked like an analog beacon from decades earlier. A metal carabiner hung below it. The carabiner was not frozen beside the unit. It was suspended within the same clear ice, its gate half open. The light should not have been visible. Even if an old battery had somehow retained a charge, the circuit could not have survived years of water, pressure, and repeated freezing. The unit was also too old to explain the other reports. Some of those searchers had detected the signal before that model entered common use. Eric recorded video of the receiver in search mode, while the camera showed the pulsing light below. The visible flash and the tone on the receiver did not occur together. The light came first. The radio pulse followed a little less than a second later. It was as though one mechanism beneath the ice flashed. Then a second one answered. We were considering whether a safe entry could be established when cloud lowered over the basin. The temperature fell quickly. Soft snow that had sagged around our boots began to stiffen. The crack made a series of brittle sounds and closed from the uphill end toward us. We retrieved the camera and removed the anchor. By the time we stepped away, only a dark line remained. The red light continued beneath it for several minutes, shining through solid ice after the walls met. Then, it disappeared. We did not excavate. That decision later drew questions from people who understood urgency but not moving ice. A crevasse is not a trench with stable sides. A narrow opening may conceal a void large enough to swallow a building. Snow and fractured ice can collapse onto rescuers, and a rope does not protect the person holding the anchor if the entire lip fails. We had no indication of a living victim, no current missing party, and worsening weather. The correct decision was to withdraw. The patrol down to White River took place inside cloud. Visibility shrank until the next wand appeared only after the previous one passed behind us. Snow gathered on our packs and melted through the shoulders of my shell. Near Glacier Basin, it changed to cold rain. By the time we reached the station, the camera had stopped functioning and moisture covered the inside of its battery compartment. The memory card survived. The receiver video showed our search display and the narrow signal peak on Eric's analyzer. The images from inside the crack showed only blue distortion and the outline of the old beacon. On the clearest frame, something else appeared deeper in the wall. It resembled a human forearm in a dark sleeve. I could see what might have been an elbow and part of a glove. The angle was wrong for an object hanging in the same crevasse. It extended horizontally through solid ice, pointing toward the beacon. When we enlarged the photograph, compression artifacts broke the shape into blocks. It could have been rock debris, fabric, or a shadow created by bubbles. Eric refused to label it as human, and he was right not to. We retained the original and forwarded it with the report. Weather closed the upper mountain that evening. Rain hammered the lower station while snow and wind struck Camp Sherman. Climbing parties held in place or descended early. Rangers at the high camp checked registrations and passed route updates during a break in communications. We were answering routine questions when one permit failed to close. The party consisted of Marcus Webb and Riley Vaughn, two experienced climbers from Oregon. They had spent the previous night at Camp Sherman and abandoned their summit attempt after seeing the forecast. A guide recalled them leaving camp shortly before dawn. Their plan was to descend the Emmons route, cross toward the Interglacier, and reach White River that afternoon. They carried a satellite messenger, avalanche equipment, shelter, and enough food to wait out weather. Both had completed several glaciated peaks. Nothing in their registration suggested carelessness. Their emergency contact reported a delayed message received shortly before noon. It contained no distress code. The text said they had stopped because Riley's transceiver showed another party below them, although no climbers were visible. Marcus intended to check the signal while Riley repaired a loose crampon strap. A second message began transmitting but never completed. Only 4 words arrived. "It is moving uphill." We called the devices and sent satellite messages. There was no answer. The high camp team attempted a limited visual search between squalls, but could not safely descend far in the whiteout. Air support was impossible. By dusk, the incident had become an overdue party response. No one mentioned our anomaly during the first planning period. We worked from facts that could guide a rescue: last known point, expected route, weather, equipment, experience, and survivability. Eric drew a search segment around the descent corridor and the place where the partial message had likely been sent. The coordinates lay roughly half a mile above our second signal point. Nina looked at me when the map appeared. Neither of us needed to speak. We left before first light with a 4-person hasty team. Eric remained in operations because someone had to coordinate the response rather than chase it. Nina and I were joined by 2 climbing rangers, Trent Ramsey and Beth Pritchard. All 4 of us carried transceivers in send mode while traveling through avalanche terrain, along with probes, shovels, technical rescue gear, medical equipment, and overnight shelter. When we needed to search for the missing transmitters, 3 members would create distance or switch off under controlled conditions while one searched. It was slower than the reckless version people see in movies, but it prevented our own signals from masking the victims. The storm had changed the approach. Wet branches dragged at our packs in the forest. Above Glacier Basin, new snow covered the previous day's surface and disguised old melt holes. Wind erased the front person's tracks within minutes. We moved on rope where the glacier demanded it and followed bearings between known terrain features. There was no dramatic darkness. There was only flat, gray light, snow striking my hood, and the constant work of judging what lay under each step. Near the lower interglacier, we found the first sign of the missing party. A bamboo wand lay flat beneath several inches of new snow. It was not one of the park markers. A strip of silver tape bore Marcus's initials. 20 yards uphill, another wand stood at an angle. The pair had been marking their descent, which was good practice in poor visibility. The next wand was more than 100 yards west of the normal line. Their route had turned away from safe terrain and toward the anomaly. We established a protected point and began a transceiver search. Beth, Trent, and Nina moved well back while I switched to search. 2 transmissions appeared. The multiple signal indicator flickered, separated them, then briefly displayed a third. One source was close and downhill. The second lay farther uphill along the missing party's diverted line. The third could not be isolated. It appeared at the edge of detection, vanished, then returned from another direction. I followed the near signal first. The distance dropped normally until I reached a shallow depression beside a wind lip. Fine search placed the transmitter less than a meter below. We probed, struck something soft, and dug. Riley Vaughn was alive beneath a collapsed snow shelter. He had excavated a trench after falling through a thin bridge and injuring his knee. Part of the roof failed during the storm, covering him without completely blocking his airspace. His beacon remained secured to his harness and transmitted throughout the night. He was cold, dehydrated, and confused, but he could answer basic questions. We stabilized him, insulated him from the ice, and gave the initial report to operations. Riley said Marcus had gone to identify the unexplained signal. They expected to find another climber buried by a small slab or fallen into a concealed crack. Marcus roped up and moved less than 200 feet before Riley heard him shout. Riley followed, broke through the bridge, and dropped into the shallow slot. His fall tore the rope from Marcus's hand. By the time Riley climbed back to the surface, wind had erased the line ahead. His transceiver still showed 2 signals. One belonged to Marcus. The other was closer. He crawled toward the closer one, believing Marcus had lost his beacon in the fall. The display led him in a circle and returned him to his own broken snow bridge. That was when his knee failed. He built the shelter, activated the satellite messenger, and waited. During the night, he felt something pass beneath the floor. Each time it passed, his transceiver changed from send to search without the selector moving. We used little dialogue. Riley was conserving heat, and we needed information more than a complete story. He showed me his receiver. The mode selector was locked in the send position with an orange safety tabbed at I. The screen, however, displayed a frozen search reading of 0.8 meters. The number changed to 0.7 while I held it. Something struck the ice beneath my knees. The impact was not loud. It felt like the dull contact of a probe against buried equipment. A second tap came 1 second later. Then, a third. Riley's screen counted down. We moved him onto the rescue sled and redistributed gear. Beth and Trent began the descent with him while Nina and I remained long enough to search for Marcus's signal. That choice was reviewed more than any other. A missing climber remained nearby with a functioning beacon and a reasonable chance of survival. We had the equipment, the position, and a narrow break in the weather. Leaving without attempting to locate him would have been indefensible. Nina switched her transceiver to search. The signal appeared uphill at a distance of 26 meters. My unit, still in send mode, flashed once and changed by itself. The display showed 2 meters. I switched my transceiver off and removed the battery. Nina's search reading remained stable. The close signal on my unit had not belonged to Marcus. It had arrived through a device that should not have been receiving anything. We marked Riley's shelter and followed Marcus's transmission on a rope. Weather opened enough to reveal the lower slopes of Steamboat Prow as a dark wall above us. Clouds still hid the summit. Fresh snow smoothed the glacier and softened every edge. Our missing climber could have been beneath any one of those quiet surfaces. Marcus's signal led toward a broken band of ice west of the normal descent. His wands ended before the first crack. One lay on the surface with its lower end compressed flat. The distance on Nina's receiver fell from 20 meters to 12, then jumped back to 18. She changed angle and approached again. The reading behaved normally until she reached the same line, where it increased without her moving. We stopped and studied the terrain instead of the screen. A faint sag crossed the new snow. It could have been a bridged crevasse or a wind feature. We protected our approach with pickets and screws, then probed from solid ice. The first probes found a void at varying depths. The pattern indicated a crevasse running diagonally across the slope. Marcus's signal came from inside it. I called our position and requested additional resources. The radio transmission broke apart, but operations received enough to know we had a live signal and were preparing an entry. Beth and Trent were below us with Riley. The nearest upper team remained at Camp Shoreman in severe weather. Nina and I had trained for two-person crevasse rescue, but training does not make a small team ideal. We built redundancy into every system and took more time than fear wanted to give us. We cut back the snow bridge from a protected stance until a narrow section of blue wall appeared. The crevasse opened beneath it into a space wider than the surface suggested. One wall sloped inward. The other dropped beyond the reach of our lights. Spindrift poured from the lip and vanished. Nina called Marcus's name. A weak response came from below and slightly uphill. The voice was enough. I clipped into the main line, backed it with a separate safety, checked every connection with Nina, and descended. Cold inside a glacier is not the same as cold wind. It surrounds the body without movement. The air smelled faintly of wet stone and old fabric. My crampon point scraped the wall, sending small shards into the dark. Blue light from the surface faded after the first 20 feet. Below that, my headlamp flattened the ice into pale plains and black openings. I found Marcus on a sloping ledge about 40 feet down. His rope had snagged around an ice horn during the fall, leaving him suspended long enough to swing onto the shelf. One ankle was injured and his face was bloodied, but he was conscious. His beacon remained in send mode. The housing was cracked, and the pulse light flashed through a film of ice. I secured him to my system and completed a rapid medical check. We had a viable patient. That simple fact narrowed the world. Whatever had drawn him there could wait. My job was to package him, communicate with Nina, and get both of us to the surface. While I worked, Marcus kept looking behind me. He had removed one glove, and the bare hand trembled against his jacket. He pointed toward the uphill wall. At first I saw only layers of blue ice. Then my light found a straight metal shaft inside the wall. It was an ice axe, embedded horizontally about 2 feet beyond the surface. The design was old, with a long wooden handle and a narrow steel pick. Above it hung a pair of round goggles. Below it, a red fabric strap curved through the ice without connecting to anything visible. My light moved farther along the wall. More objects appeared. There was a canvas pack with leather buckles, a modern aluminum shovel blade, a ski pole bent into a shallow arc, and several carabiners of different ages. Some lay deeper than others, but they did not form the downward sequence that accumulated snow should create. Old and new equipment occupied the same blue band. A plastic helmet manufactured within the previous decade sat behind the wooden axe. A wool mitten rested closer to the surface than both. Every object pointed in the same direction. Axe picks, straps, buckles, and broken shafts angled toward a dark oval inside the ice. The oval moved when Marcus's beacon flashed. It did not move like a body. It changed position between pulses. At one flash, the darkness lay several feet to the left. At the next, it appeared closer to us. Clear ice remained in front of it. I saw no passage connecting the positions. A low click traveled through the wall each time it shifted, followed by the radio tone from Nina's receiver above. I understood why the old beacon in our camera image had flashed before the signal reached our receivers. The light was not a status indicator. Something was pressing or charging dead equipment inside the glacier one piece at a time. The radio pulse was an answer produced after the contact. I told Nina to begin the haul. She tightened the main line while I guided Marcus away from the ledge. The first lift moved him several feet. Then the rope stopped. I checked for a snag. The line ran cleanly to the lip. Marcus's damaged rope and pack had been left on the ledge. Nothing attached us to the wall. Nina applied more force through the hauling system. The The line stretched and vibrated but did not rise. Ice had closed around Marcus's right boot. The surface looked transparent. There was no crack or liquid water. His crampon and lower boot simply continued into the wall as though the ice had formed around them over a winter. He felt pressure but no immediate pain. I struck carefully around the boot with my tool. The ice chipped normally for the first inch. Beneath that, the pick rebounded from a dense clear layer that rang like metal. The dark oval shifted closer. Marcus's beacon flashed. The ice around his boot tightened enough to bend one crampon point. I cut the boot. It was an expensive double mountaineering boot, and the cut exposed him to frost injury. But tissue damage was better than permanent entrapment. I opened the gaiter, sliced the outer shell and laces, and pulled his foot from the liner while Nina held tension. The shell remained inside the wall. The instant his foot came free, the haul lifted him. He rose past my shoulder. I climbed behind him, using my ascenders on the safety line. The darkness in the wall followed at our height. Each radio pulse from Marcus' beacon moved it another few feet. Above us, Nina called that his signal was becoming so strong, her receiver could no longer separate it from another source. I reached for Marcus' beacon and switched it off. The pulse light continued. I opened the battery compartment. There was no battery inside. Marcus saw it and began to struggle. I held him against the line until the movement passed. Panic inside a crevasse wastes oxygen, dislodges ice, and creates mistakes. I told Nina we had an equipment anomaly and instructed her to keep hauling. That language was absurdly small for what I was holding, but it gave all of us a procedure to follow. The dark oval stopped moving when the beacon went into my pack. For several seconds, I believed containment had interrupted whatever connected it to the ice. Then a red flash appeared through the fabric behind my shoulder. The wall beside my head cracked. Not outward. A thin line opened inside the clear ice and traveled ahead of us toward the surface. Another line formed parallel to it. Between them, the ice became darker, creating a human-width channel that climbed faster than Nina could haul. The thing in the glacier was not following Marcus. It was following the pulse. I carried a spare training transmitter in the top of my pack. We use spares during long responses because damaged equipment is common. Its battery was installed, but it was switched off. I took it out, changed it to send, and attached it to the end of Marcus's abandoned rope. Then I lowered it toward the black depth below the ledge. The new pulse light flashed. Every old piece of equipment inside the wall moved at once. The wooden axe turned several degrees within solid ice. Carabiners snapped shut. The red strap straightened. Deeper shapes appeared where no light had reached before. Boots, packs, lengths of rope, and pale fragments that might have been ice. A row of dark forms leaned toward the descending transmitter. The channel beside us stopped climbing. I released the rope. The spare beacon fell into darkness, still sending. The response did not sound like a fall. It sounded like a zipper being pulled through the glacier, one hard tooth at a time. Red flashes descended behind the ice. The dark oval followed them. Nina hauled Marcus through the surface opening. I was less than 10 feet below when the line around my harness went slack. The anchor had not failed. The ice between Nina and me had closed around the rope. The main line and safety line entered a clear band above me and disappeared. I could feel Nina loading the system, but the force ended inside the wall. Pulling harder would only cut the ropes or break the lip. I placed 2 screws at waist height, clipped myself to them, and transferred my weight off the trapped lines. Then I told Nina to stop hauling. Our radios worked poorly through ice, but I could hear enough to know Marcus was secured at the surface. Nina asked whether I could climb free. I looked upward. The channel that had formed beside us remained darker than the surrounding wall, but its sides were closing. Fine fractures faded as pressure returned. There was no opening large enough for my shoulders. Below, the spare beacon continued to pulse. Each transmission produced a faint click farther down the glacier. The intervals were becoming more distant. Whatever had followed it was moving away, but it would eventually reach the hanging rope or the bottom of the crevasse. I did not know what would happen then. I cut myself free of the two trapped lines. That sounds reckless until you understand that I was already attached to the ice screws. A rope connected to an unreachable anchor is not rescue equipment. It is weight. I retained enough length for a short tether, then began traversing along the sloping wall. I placed a screw, moved to it, placed another, and removed the one behind. The method was slow, but it kept me protected above the unseen drop. I followed airflow. Spindrift had entered from the main opening, but a second cold current touched the right side of my face. Somewhere along the crevasse, another connection reached the surface. I turned off my headlamp for a moment and saw a weak gray seam ahead. Nina understood before I finished describing it. She moved across the protected surface, probing until she located the branch opening. We worked toward each other through several feet of snow and brittle ice. Her shovel made dull impacts overhead. My tool answered from below. The sound was ordinary, human, and better than any voice. The spare beacon stopped transmitting. Every embedded object in the wall clicked once. The screws beneath my feet began to pull sideways. I abandoned the traverse and climbed toward the gray seam. Nina broke through as I reached the final shelf. New snow poured down my collar. She lowered a fresh rope and I clipped into it without ceremony. The branch was barely wide enough. My pack caught twice, so I removed it and pushed it ahead. Nina hauled while I climbed. Behind me, the blue walls pressed together with a grinding vibration that I felt through both tools. I reached the surface on my stomach. Nina dragged me clear. The opening closed around the lower part of my pack and held it until one shoulder strap tore away. When we pulled the remaining rope, its end emerged smooth and flattened, identical to the old route wand. We did not remain at the site. Marcus was conscious but hypothermic, with an injured ankle and a bare foot wrapped inside Nina's spare mittens and insulated layers. We placed him in the sled and moved downhill. Clouds swallowed our route again. The work became slow and familiar. Protect the slopes, maintain spacing, check the patience, navigate from wand to wand, and keep everyone moving before cold converted exhaustion into another emergency. We reunited with Beth and Trent below the broken zone. Riley had improved after warming, but could not walk on his injured knee. Additional rescuers met us near Glacier Basin. Weather prevented immediate aviation, so both patients were carried to lower terrain. Marcus spoke very little. Each time someone's transceiver produced a routine function tone, his entire body tightened against the litter straps. At White River, medical personnel found no cold injury severe enough to threaten his foot. His ankle was fractured and Riley had ligament damage, but both men survived. Their rescue entered the statistics as a successful ground operation involving an overdue climbing party, storm exposure, a crevasse fall, and technical evacuation. Every word of that description was true. Marcus's cracked beacon came out in my pack. The selector remained in send mode. Its battery compartment was empty and dry. He insisted the battery had been installed at Camp Sherman and that the unit had passed a partner check before descent. Riley confirmed it. The manufacturer later tested the beacon and found damage consistent with compression, but no mechanism that could transmit without power or force another device into search mode. 2 days after the rescue, a team returned to document the site and look for our ropes, Marcus's boot, and the embedded equipment. Warm weather had triggered icefall in the broken band. Several blocks had collapsed across the search area, and new fractures made entry unacceptable. The surface marker Nina placed remained, but the crevasse beneath it no longer connected to the chamber we described. The team found one short section of rope and debris. Both ends were pinched flat. The glacier had not erased the evidence. It had made the evidence too dangerous to reach, which is a more ordinary and more effective way for a mountain to keep something. The review lasted most of that summer. We supplied GPS tracks, equipment records, photographs, radio logs, medical reports, and separate statements. No one accused us of inventing what happened. They did what competent investigators do. They divided observations from interpretations and searched for causes that could be tested. The old beacon in the photograph might have been debris distorted by ice. The dark shape might have been rock. The changing distance readings might have resulted from overlapping signals and unusual transmitter orientation. The opening of the crevasse might have been an unstable bridge failing along a pre-existing fracture. Marcus's battery could have fallen out during the accident, although the compartment door had remained latched. Stress, cold, and poor visibility could explain differences in memory. No single explanation covered everything, but an official report does not require one elegant cause when several common causes can occupy the same space. The final assessment emphasized objective hazards: deteriorating weather, route deviation, concealed crevasses, equipment damage, and complex radio fields. It recommended renewed training on signal separation and conservative route choices. Those were good recommendations. I helped teach them. The archived cases remained separate. We could not prove that the earlier unidentified transmissions came from the same source. Glacier movement made the old positions approximate, and incomplete records prevented reliable comparison. Even so, Nina plotted every usable point. When adjusted only for the broad downhill flow of the interglacier, they formed a loose line through the same broken corridor. Signal reports clustered in years when rescuers spent longer periods searching with multiple receivers. Missing person operations produced the longest detections. There were gaps in the record that neither of us tried to fill with imagination. Mount Rainier has taken climbers through weather, falls, avalanches, rockfall, exposure, illness, and errors that any experienced person can make. I will not assign an unexplained force to deaths that already have human families and credible causes. I can say only that several pieces of equipment photographed inside that wall resembled gear listed as unrecovered in old incidents. The wooden axe was too generic to identify. The red strap matched nothing specific. The modern helmet shared a color and vent pattern with one lost during a rescue years earlier, but thousands like it had been sold. Marcus and Riley never returned to climb Rainier. Riley answered questions during the review and then asked not to be contacted again. Marcus sent me one message the following winter. He had opened a storage box containing the equipment from the rescue and found gray water beneath the beacon. The box had been kept inside a heated apartment. He disposed of the unit after the agency released it. I did not ask how. Nina stayed with the climbing program for several more seasons. Eric retired. I eventually moved to a position that kept me below glacier level. That change was not caused by one incident alone. 11 seasons on the mountain leave, injuries, fatigue, and people you cannot stop remembering. But the experience altered the way I responded to a transceiver signal. I still carried a beacon when conditions required it. Refusing proven safety equipment because of one unexplained event would have been superstition disguised as caution. I completed partner checks, replaced batteries, practiced searches, and taught visitors to do the same. The change was smaller. Whenever a signal pulled me away from a known route, I stopped before following the arrow. I looked at the snow, the slope, the wind, and the physical evidence. I asked whether a person had actually traveled in that direction. A machine can tell you that it detects energy. It cannot tell you what produced it or why. The last time I heard the signal was not on Mount Rainier. It happened 3 years after I left the climbing program during an avalanche course at a county training facility. The instructors had buried practice transmitters in a flat snowfield beside the building. I was there to observe, not teach. At the end of the day, students recovered every unit and checked them against the inventory. One receiver continued to show a signal beneath the empty field. The instructor assumed a device had been missed. We searched on foot and found a minimum near the center of the trampled snow. The screen showed 2.1 meters. Probes struck frozen soil less than a foot down. There was no pipe, cable, or buried room under the field. The other receivers detected nothing. I recognized the unit in my hand. It was the same receiver I had carried during the first training patrol on the Glacier. It had been transferred with surplus equipment after I left the park. The battery compartment had been replaced, the firmware updated, and the housing marked with a new inventory number. The distance dropped to 1.9 while I stood still. I removed the battery. The screen stayed on. No one else heard the first tap. The students were carrying equipment toward the building, and a snowplow was working on the road. I felt it through the soles of my boots. A second impact followed beneath the frozen ground, then a third, each one separated by a second. I placed the receiver on the snow and walked away. The number continued to fall. At 0.8 meters, the display changed from a distance to a direction arrow. It did not point down at the ground. It pointed west, toward Mount Rainier.
Xong rồi. Anh, chắc anh không trong này. Đây, rồi ok, để em quay luôn cho anh. Chắc anh không ngồi trong này, không nhìn thấy. Đấy, em quay luôn cho anh. Đấy, 3 cây như này. Một cây rất là lùm luôn, trên 20 phân. Đấy. Đấy, một cây như này. Đấy, 3 cây thì em nói 3 cây thì nó là 379k và bao ship hoàn toàn luôn. Cho anh, chắc anh không ngồi trong này, không nhìn thấy. Đấy, em quay luôn cho anh. Đây, em cho anh xem mặt hoa của dòng 555 mặt hoa này. Đây, hiện tại là nó sẽ là 5 mặt hoa này. Đấy. Hello Lina, ôi Lina hôm nay sang bên top à? Đấy, 5 mặt hoa này. Nhận được ấy chưa? Nhận được ấy chưa em? Nhận được ảnh chưa? Anh gửi 20 mấy ảnh sang cho em rồi đó. Đấy, đây một mặt hoa này. Đấy, là 5 mặt hoa. Đây là 5 mặt hoa chuẩn nhá. Đây là 5 mặt hoa chuẩn. Đấy, đây là 5 mặt hoa chuẩn. Cây em sẽ bê lên sau nhá. Đấy, đây là 5 mặt hoa chuẩn. Đấy, 5 mặt hoa chuẩn của cái combo này. Đấy, còn anh thích có thể em đổi combo và em có đổi màu được tùy theo màu bác thích. Đấy là cái mà em sẽ chiều cho mọi người hết cỡ thì thôi. Đấy, còn cây hiện tại nó như nào đúng không? Mọi người đang thắc mắc cây của một combo 10 nó sẽ như nào, nó rẻ. Làm giúp đi mai hội TikTok, mai lại có vụ gì à? Mai là hội gì đấy? Trời ơi, sao dạo là các bác lên lắm hội thế? Các bác nên vừa hội thôi để anh bán cái này chết. Đây em sẽ lên cho mọi người để mọi người không thắc mắc cái combo 10 như nào nhé. Không các bác lại bảo là cái cây 65k cho cái cây bé tí đấy không? Đây em sẽ lên cho mọi người xem luôn cái combo dòng 10 nó sẽ như thế nào. Đây. 65k không phải đồng nghĩa với cây bé đâu nhé mọi người. Đấy, nó là dòng cây là khá là to nhá. Đây. Nó đây. Đấy, nó đây. Đấy, combo 10 em nói là sự mọi người, nó là combo cực kỳ hời cho cả nhà luôn, cực kỳ hời. Đây là 5 cây chuẩn mặt hoa đây. Đấy. Ây là lại thế à? Anh tưởng vừa xong một vụ rồi mai lại tiếp. Được đầu thật. Ok đấy, combo 10 đây. Đấy mọi người nhé. Đấy cho mọi người nhìn combo 10 đây. Đấy, đúng rồi, mua combo 10 này là sưu tầm rất nhiều mặt hoa luôn, rất nhiều mặt hoa luôn. Đấy. Đó là chứ út mà không mua nhiều thì chắc khả năng là út cũng phải lấy phải combo nữa rồi. Thì bác Vượng là bác lấy mất của em 3-4 combo lại này rồi. Đấy, cây nó sẽ như này nha bác Vượng. Đấy, cho bác nhìn cây luôn. Nó không phải là cái cây mọi người tưởng tượng là bé tí đâu nhá. Đấy, cây này là cây nữ hoàng hoa lan chị Phạm Ngọc Nhàn hay còn gọi là cát le đấy, hay còn gọi là dòng hoa cát le. Đây là những cây mà toàn trên 3 năm của em hết rồi. Đây à? Anh có biết đâu. Đấy. Ok anh trưởng nhắn tin qua cho em. Đấy, anh trưởng cứ nhắn tin qua giáp nào cho em. Rất là đẹp luôn. Đây là 5 cây nhé, 5 cây sổ còn đẹp hơn anh trưởng. Đây là 5 cây hàng chuẩn này. Đấy, còn 5 cây hàng sổ này. Đấy, các bác biết thừa rằng là dòng hoa Cattleya không phải là dòng rẻ tiền. Em nói thẳng luôn, dòng hoa Cattleya không phải là dòng rẻ tiền. Và tại sao em bán rẻ? Vì cái số lượng nó hiện tại đang rất là nhiều, nhưng mà em muốn đẩy một số lượng rất là lớn đi. Đấy, để số lượng lớn đi được em còn làm việc khác. Nên là em nói thẳng luôn là em đang đẩy một cái giá làm sao anh chị không thể tưởng tượng nổi được, mà mọi người cũng không thể bao giờ mua được luôn đấy. Em nói thẳng luôn, mọi người không được mua được luôn. Đây là 5 cây hàng sổ nhá, 5 cây hàng sổ. Ok chưa? 5 cây hàng sổ và 5 cây hàng chuẩn. Đấy, cây hàng sổ nó to cỡ như này. Cây hàng sổ năm nay có thể cho hoa cho mọi người rồi. Đấy, 650k em bao ship 10 cây. 10 chậu khác nhau, không chậu nào trùng chậu nào cả. Đấy, không chậu nào trùng mã chậu nào. Mọi người yên tâm, cây cối mọi người anh chị sẽ được xem rất là kỹ luôn. Rất là kỹ luôn. Đấy, đây. Một combo đó là như này, em đứng xa xa cho mọi người. Một combo nó sẽ là như này. Đấy, hai khay, mỗi khay 5 cây. Rất là rõ nét luôn, cây to gầm cỡ như này. Anh chị chỉ cần làm một combo này thôi là cũng có thể đủ phủ một cái diện, một góc vườn của mình rồi. Đấy, mà cây này là bên em là cây hàng trồng phổ thông. Đều dòng hoa thơm hết toàn bộ nhá, riêng các này không có dòng hoa nào là không có mùi cả, trừ dòng Brat ra. Còn đây là tất cả những cái dòng hoa em cầm trên tay này hiện tại bây giờ đều là dòng hoa rất là thơm, và đặc trưng của nó là mùi thơm của mùi hoa hồng. Mùi hoa hồng và mùi thơm rất là mát. Đấy, giá hiện tại bây giờ bên em đang bán cả một cái combo 10 chậu to cỡ như này, các anh chị mua tầm 2 triệu, bên em bán bao nhiêu? 650k bao ship. Em bao ship luôn. Và gì nữa? Và em tặng cho mọi người thêm một cái dòng hoa thơm nữa là dòng trầm lá biên. Dòng trầm lá biên mọi người nhé, em tặng thêm cho mọi người một cái dòng trầm lá biên nữa. Đây thì em lấy, cho em tí, em lấy cây dòng trầm lá biên này. Cái trầm lá biên này anh chị có thể trồng chậu, có thể trồng chậu cây đủ các thể loại luôn, anh muốn trồng đâu trồng, tại vì rất là lâu năm rồi. Nên mọi người cứ yên tâm là chơi thôi. Em đang đẩy một cái giá mà anh chị không thể tưởng tượng nổi được, không bao giờ mọi người tưởng tượng nổi được. Sẽ có một cái line nào bán một cái giá nó lúc như này. Đấy, cái dòng trầm lá biên bên em gửi cho mọi người nó sẽ là cái dòng trầm lá biên. Tại sao gọi là trầm lá biên vàng? Trầm lá biên vàng vì sao? Vì nó là cái lá nó như này. Đấy, mọi người nhìn lá chưa? Mà hoa rất là thơm luôn. Cái dòng hoa trầm lá biên này nó cực kỳ thơm luôn. Đấy, chốt theo combo cho tiện đi shop. Đây combo đây là chị Phương Lê. Combo này cứ lên cho em là combo 10 thôi là được. Tại vì combo này nó combo mặc định rồi. Đấy, nên là mọi người chỉ cần viết cho em là combo 10 là xong. Đấy, là nó sẽ là 10 cây, nó sẽ là 10 cây như này là chị Phương Lê. Đấy, còn lúc nào mà em lên cái combo mà ví dụ như là các màu khác nhau ấy, hoặc là 35 ấy thì em sẽ lên, em sẽ đọc combo. Đấy, nhưng combo này sẽ em mặc định nó là combo 10. Tại vì nó là một combo mà gần như là không lẫn vào bất cứ một combo nào được cả. Ví dụ combo 3 thì nó có thể là combo 3 này có thể màu xanh đỏ tím, nhưng combo kia lại vàng trắng chẳng hạn. Đấy thì em mới lên combo theo tên của nó. Còn đây các bác cứ lên combo 10 chưa? Mặc định của nó sẽ là gì ạ? 5 màu sổ và gì ạ? Và 5 màu trỏ. Ok chưa? Đấy, và tặng thì em sẽ tặng trầm lá biên này, dòng trầm lá biên này về gì ạ? Về cho mọi người cấy vào cây. Đây là cái dòng trầm mà mọi người không thể kiếm được nó. Dạ vâng, ok anh trưởng. Đấy anh chị nào thích nhá. Rồi ok út này. Đấy, anh chị nào thích combo này, mọi người cứ chốt combo cho em thôi. Đấy, cứ chốt combo cho em thôi. Đấy. Tại vì sao? Vì nếu mà bây giờ ấy, mà lên từng combo này thực tế mà nói ấy, thì nó rất là lâu mà mất thời gian của anh chị. Đấy. Cái đây là mọi người, nếu mà mọi người đã thích combo 10 ấy, mọi người cứ chỉ việc ra gắn lên combo 10 chưa. Còn cái việc mà mai em sẽ quay cây lại cho anh chị, nếu anh chị cảm thấy ưng thì chúng ta đi đơn, còn không ưng thì thôi anh chị hủy đơn bình thường chưa, không vấn đề gì cả. Đấy. Đây là combo em vừa lấy cho khách xong, khách đặt từ chiều. Đấy, và em vừa lên em nhặt cho khách xong. Đấy, và anh nghĩ ok, em quay lại cho anh chị xem để làm sao, để làm bằng chứng khi đi đơn về. Nếu như nhá, nếu như nó sai cây, em quay cây to này cho anh chị đúng không, về mà gửi mà đúng mà cây mà không phải cây to như này, không phải cái cây mà đúng như trong video em quay, anh chị có quyền lấy cả đơn ấy về mà không cần hoàn lại. Đấy, và em cũng sẽ là trực tiếp giả lại, em giả lại cái đơn cọc, giả lại cái tiền cọc. Đấy, như bác Lâm vừa rồi ấy, là bác gì, bác giả, bác gọi là gì, chuyển hết luôn. Tại vì sao? Mọi người biết em bán cái combo này nó quá nhiều rồi. Đấy, combo quá nhiều rồi. Hello em. Đấy, nên là cái này mọi người yên tâm nhé, anh chị chỉ cần việc lên combo nào, kể cả như em nhiều khi em chỉ lên một combo mẫu ấy, tại vì ở đây thực sự mà nói thông cảm em chỉ có một mình thôi, thế đâm ra là nhiều khi chạy đi chạy lại là anh chị cũng ao hết rồi. Nên là em cố gắng em giữ được em ở trên cái line này càng lâu càng tốt nhất trong mọi thời điểm, chứ nhiều khi em đi em lấy cây cái là quay lại mọi người hết rồi. Em không anh ạ, em thực ra em không nhớ tên của mấy cái dòng ấy đâu, Tại vì thực ra mà nó ở vườn em thì nó nhiều mã lắm, nhưng mà đa số thì em sẽ nhớ tên theo của tên của Latin thôi, tức là tên Latin thôi. Đấy, chứ còn nếu mà tên của thằng mấy cái thằng mà tên của đấy này em không biết đâu. Đấy, tại vì ở vườn em đa số là tên của tiếng Latin thôi, ở dạng như kiểu là của dòng của tên của Thái ấy. Đấy, còn tên của Việt Nam thì hầu như em không biết. Tại vì ở đây bây giờ hiện tại em đã hơn 100 mã rồi. Đấy, nhưng mà đa số là toàn là Latin hết. Đấy. Được anh ạ, khả năng là được, khả năng là được nhé, khả năng là được. Đây nó to tầm cỡ như này thì khả năng là được. Đấy, nhưng mà combo 3, combo 10 là xác định cho em nhé, là nó sẽ nhỏ hơn combo 3 và combo 5. Đấy, thì có khả năng là được của năm nay hoặc cùng nắm sang năm sau cho anh thôi. Tại vì đôi khi là toàn tầm 3 năm rưỡi 4 năm hết rồi. Đấy, cái này về em nghĩ rằng là anh cho anh chăm tốt ok thì nó vẫn ra bình thường luôn, nhất là cái dòng gì, nhất là cái dòng sổ này. Hàng sổ này thì sẽ nhiều cơ hội ra hoa hơn là gì, hơn là nhiều của cái hàng gì, hàng chuẩn này. Đấy, hàng chuẩn này, hàng sổ nó sẽ to hơn rất là nhiều. Đấy. Đấy, cả mỗi combo này là chỉ có 650k thôi, 650k mọi người nhé, combo 650k. Đấy, anh chị nào thích thì báo em. Đấy, anh Tùng Trần nhé. Đấy, 650k. Làm gì có ông nào bán kiểu này với em được, thực sự nó không có đâu, bởi em đang xả rất là nhanh luôn. Đấy, nên cả nhà cứ tranh thủ mà lấy, em bao sự luôn. Đấy. Cứ tranh thủ mà lấy thôi. Anh có cây mà lá nó màu tím ấy, em không, mà lá màu tím mà lá màu tím thì như không có, hình như em không có vậy, hình như không có lá màu tím. Đấy, 650k mọi người nhé. Đấy, đây là combo 10, đây là combo 10. Đấy, bác nào thích thì cứ báo em, to cỡ như này. Mọi người không mua, mọi người mua combo này. Đấy. Còn bây giờ nếu mà bảo như mà combo 10 mà muốn như combo 379 này của em ấy thì là không có. Đấy, anh chị hiểu ý em không? Đấy. Ví dụ như là anh chị bảo là ô thế tại sao mà cái nó không to như combo này đúng không? Thì nó thật sự ra là không có, không thể được. Đấy, nó khác nhau hoàn toàn điểm đấy chứ. Đấy, đây là một combo cũng khá là to. Đấy, combo này bây giờ nhẹ nhàng nhất thì cũng phải rơi vào tầm, cũng nhẹ nhàng nhất, em cho nhẹ nhàng nhất thì cũng là 550 đi đúng không? Đấy là 500 đến 550 đi. Đấy. Còn đây là combo này em bán là bao nhiêu? 379k cho mọi người. Ok chưa? Đấy, 379k. Đấy, một combo to này. Đấy. Đấy. Một cái chậu lùm cỡ như này thì cũng đủ cái giá 300 rồi đúng không ạ? Thường các bác đi săn là thường các bạn 300 rồi đúng không? Một đống thân luôn, em không biết bao nhiêu thân, cái này về các bác tự tách thôi. Đấy. 3 chậu. Ok chưa? Đấy, lùm cỡ như này mà chỉ có 379k, em còn bao ship, em chứ không những em còn bao ship, em còn tặng quà. Đấy, còn có quà đi theo cho mọi người đấy. Đấy, ok, rất nhiều quà trong một combo thì em cũng không biết là mọi người còn đắn đo gì ở trong những combo này của em. Đấy, hàng trồng vỏ thông nhá, hàng này hàng trồng vỏ thông này. Thứ hai nữa là gì? Thứ hai là trồng lâu năm rồi này. Đấy, vườn của em là trồng rất lâu năm rồi, cái dòng cây này là trồng lâu năm rồi chứ không phải là dòng cây bọn em mua và em tách. Tại vì đây mọi người cứ nhìn cái chậu cái rễ này biết này. Đấy, đây là tại sao bọn em đang phải thay chậu rất là nhiều đây. Đấy, bây giờ em đang vào chiến dịch thay chậu lại toàn bộ đây. Đấy. Đấy, mọi người nhìn cái bộ rễ là mọi người biết này, rêu phong đầy đủ này. Đấy, chứ còn làm gì mà có ai bán cái chậu như bọn em mà sao? Cái sạch sẽ, lúc nào bọn em cái chậu mà chậu người ta nó sạch sẽ cơ, còn cái chậu bọn em mới rêu phong nó đầy đấy. Đấy, cái này về mọi người sang chậu cũng được mà không sang chậu cũng được. Đấy, nếu mà sang chậu được thì càng tốt. Đấy, sang chậu được cho em thì càng tốt, thì cây nó càng khỏe càng đẹp hơn. Đấy, còn không sang chậu ấy, thì nó sẽ bị khống chế ở trong cái chậu này, nó sẽ bị khống chế ở trong cái chậu F12 này. Đấy, và cây nó chỉ phát triển một cái tầm lực cái này thôi. Rồi em còn một combo này. Đấy, em còn cái combo này, combo 379 này. Còn anh chị nào thích màu nào, thích combo nào thì mọi người có thể lên combo cho. Để em đảm bảo luôn cho mọi người là cái giá thì không một cái nhà nào có thể đấu lại bọn em được cái giá này. Em nói em khẳng định luôn cái giá đấy. Cái lá màu tím thì em không có rồi anh Thắng ơi. Rồi đấy, combo 10, combo 10, combo 10 đây. Dạ có chứ anh Bảo, bên em vẫn chia sẻ bình thường mà. Anh có gì anh cứ nhắn tin cho em có cả bản chăm sóc bình thường cơ. Có màu hoa không? Hoa màu gì shop đây, em cho anh xem lại màu hoa. Sorry bác, vừa lên mải nói quá mà chưa quên cho mọi người xem lại. Đây, cái màu hoa của ba cái chậu đấy nó sẽ là màu hoa màu trắng, màu này rất là thơm này. Cái màu này rất là thơm mọi người nhé, màu này rất là thơm này, mà nó thơm rất là lâu, rất là thơm bền. Đấy. Màu hoa thứ hai em lên cho màu hoa thứ hai mà em vừa lên đấy là màu hoa này, dòng gì ạ? Dòng Sayagusa số 3. dòng xe ông sao số 3. Đấy, dòng xe cho anh Đình Sang này. Đấy, xe ông sao số 3. Và dòng thứ ba là gì ạ? Dòng thứ ba cho anh nữa là dòng mà thân lùm nhất, nhiều nhất thân vừa rồi ấy, trên 20 thân ấy. Thì chậu đấy nó là chậu thuộc cái dòng của dòng La Con 3. Dòng La Con 3, La Con Chai Si D-Line số 3. Đấy, La Con Chai Si D-Line dòng số 3. Ok mọi người, đấy, ba cái chậu to cỡ như thế mà chỉ có 379k, làm sao anh chị mua ở ngoài không bao giờ có luôn. Em nói là nó rẻ nhất bây giờ mọi người mua cũng 180 một chậu rồi. Đây mà em bán cho mọi người 379k, ba cái chậu to đùng, một cái chậu đấy không thôi nó đã 350 rồi. Nếu mà trồng chậu bình thường như của em đấy, còn nếu mà trồng sang chậu F20 thì em chắc phải gì ạ? Em chắc phải em nghĩ nó phải lên tầm 500 cái chậu đấy. Độc quyền giá đúng không ạ? Thực ra nói anh cũng kiểu gọi là nếu mà nói đúng, nói như em cũng đúng, cũng không sai. Nếu mà nói về giá hiện tại bây giờ thì anh có thể độc quyền giá được, tại vì cái này là tự mình trồng, tự mình bán, thì không qua bất cứ một trung gian nào, cũng không nhập bất cứ của ai cả, thì đâm ra mọi người sẽ mua được cái giá rất là rẻ. Tại vì giá này nó giá xỉ nhà vườn đi ra, đâm ra là có là nó thấp hơn cả giá xỉ. Chứ em mọi người nên lên cái combo 10 ấy, mọi người nhìn không, làm xỉ có cây đấy mà bán 65k. Em thấy mọi người đổ xô đi mua cái cây có như này thôi mà hết giá đến 120, mọi người vẫn cứ mua mà. Thì làm sao mà bán cái giá mà 100k mà bán được, đúng không ạ? Rồi ok mọi người, đấy anh chị nào thích thì báo em nhé. Hôm nay là có bác Lâm, anh Lâm lên mở hàng. Anh Lâm lên mở hàng. Đấy, 379k cho anh chị nào thích thì báo em. Dạ vâng, ok bác Đình Sang. Bác Đình Sang lên số dùm em nhé. Bác Đình Sang lấy combo 379 đúng không ạ? Đấy, lên số lại dùm em. Lên số mới lên địa chỉ cho em luôn. Đây em quay luôn trên live luôn. Đấy, hôm nay em vừa bán em vừa quay trên live luôn cho các bác. Đấy. Đây em quay trên live cho anh Lâm luôn. Cây nó như này, đây một cây này, màu trắng này. Đây còn cái cây lùm đây. Cây lùm đấy. Đấy, cây lùm đây. Nó quá lùm luôn. Đấy, đấy, xem thì cho em ý kiến luôn nhé. Đấy, xem thì cho em ý kiến luôn. Đấy, và một cây nó sẽ như thế này. Đấy anh Sang nhé. Shop gửi điện thoại được rồi. Ok anh Sang. Em vừa gửi tạm hình ảnh qua mét cho anh nhé. Anh Sang cứ xem qua mét đi. Đây quên mất em, hôm nay em lại không ghim. Rồi ok, để em ghi số điện thoại của em nhé. Đây được rồi, ok em ghi số tài khoản rồi đây. Em ghi số tài khoản lên rồi. Đấy, nhầm, em ghi số điện thoại em lên rồi. Đấy thì có gì bác kết bạn xem nào em qua cái số điện thoại của em ấy. Rồi anh Đình Sang này. Combo này, combo là combo số 1. Đấy, combo số 1. 372 này. Cộng với 215 này. Cộng với 103 này. Đấy, mà có 379k nữa, 379k bao ship luôn rồi. Anh Đình Sang rồi đấy mọi người, ai thích cái combo như thế nào mọi người cứ báo em nhé. Thích combo màu gì, thích combo màu như thế nào đấy, thì mọi người cứ báo qua cho em. Đấy, hôm nay các bác mua trong tin nhắn của em hơi nhiều đấy, shop trên lại các bạn Zalo nhé. Rồi ok, các bác đẩy tin nhắn Zalo tin nhắn bên net khá là nhiều. 0948. Rồi ok mọi người, đấy anh chị nào thích cái combo nào thì báo em nhé, thích cái màu nào thì cứ báo em. Cái chậu này á, cái bụi này anh xem này, nếu như mà theo những ước tính của cái bụi này á, một chậu này tầm khoảng 6 chậu, tầm khoảng 6 chậu, nếu mà đến là ghép 3, tầm khoảng 6 chậu. Nhưng mà nếu mà ghép mà nếu mà cái này mà ghép cẩn thận đấy, ghép cẩn thận mà không bị ấy đấy, thì nó chỉ đó được khoảng tầm 4 chậu, khoảng 4 chậu. Đây còn cái chậu này không thôi thì đã ghép được khoảng tầm đây. Chậu này cũng phải được tầm 3 chậu rồi. Đấy, 3 chậu ở cái chậu này rồi. Đấy, ít nhất là 3 chậu ở chậu này. Đây là ít nhất là 3 chậu ở chậu này rồi. Combo 10 chậu bác. Combo 10 chậu anh Trần Ngọc, combo 10 đây là combo 3 đây anh Trần Ngọc ạ. Combo 10 chậu là 650k cơ. Đấy. Không thấy chị Hương Rừng không thấy cái gì hả chị Hương Rừng? Chị Hương Rừng muốn xem combo nào? Muốn xem combo nào thì báo em nhé. Đây là combo 3 nhé. Combo 3 đây anh Trần Ngọc. Đấy, còn combo 10 em vừa lên. Đấy, combo 10 bác có combo 10 thì báo em. Em cho các bác xem lại. Đây combo 10 là combo mà em muốn bán nhất. Tại vì sao thì combo thứ nhất là mọi người sẽ chơi, mọi người sẽ được gọi là rẻ nhất. Đấy, đây combo 10 đây anh Trần Ngọc. Đấy, combo 10 đây mọi người nhé. Để em cho mọi người xem lại combo 10. Đấy, đây mới là combo 10 này. Đấy, chậu nó sẽ nhỏ hơn cái chậu của combo 3, combo 5 một chút. Đấy. Nhưng mà cái chậu này thực ra mà nói thì giờ mới thấy rồi chị. Giờ thấy chị không? Đấy, đây là combo 10 này. Đấy, combo 10 nó sẽ cỡ như này. Cây cũng không phải là vừa phải, cũng không phải là cây không phải là cây bé mọi người nhé, nên mọi người đừng nghĩ em bán 65k một cây này ở combo 10 mình nghĩ là cây bé nhé. Đấy, mọi người nghĩ là cây bé, cây rất là to luôn. Đấy, 65k mà một cây như này thì em nói anh chị làm sao mà mọi người mua được đâu 65k một cây hàng như này. Đúng không? Bản lá to cỡ như này rồi. To bằng gần 2 đốt ngón tay của em rồi. Đấy, có những lá to, lá nhỏ nhưng mà thường lá sẽ là cao nha. Đấy, đây là combo 10. Nó sẽ có 10 chậu khác nhau. Đấy, em cảm ơn chị Hương Rừng nhé. Nó sẽ có 10 chậu khác nhau mọi người nhé. 10 chậu tức là tương ứng với 10 màu khác nhau nhé, không cùng một màu đâu. Đấy, nên là anh chị nào thích combo 10 này là combo mà sưu tầm được nhiều cây nhất, là nó đấy. Sưu tầm được nhiều cây nhất mà giá rẻ nhất thì là nó. Đấy. Nhưng mà nó chỉ nằm trong combo 10 mọi người nhé. Nằm ngoài combo 10 thì không có giá 65 rồi. Tại vì cái này nó là quy định rồi. Đây rồi em lên cái combo nhẹ nhẹ hơn cho mọi người. Nhẹ hơn một chút cho mọi người. Đợt này bên em đang tập trung vào trồng nhiều quá đâm ra là không tuyển cây lên được. Hoa đại chị ạ, hoa đại, dòng hoa đại. Đúng rồi anh Nhật Ngọc ơi. Xem những loại hoa nào đẹp mà hoa thơm. Anh Toàn, hoa là cũng thơm anh ạ. Hoa là cũng thơm, hoa là cũng đẹp nhưng mà còn tùy vào màu sắc của bác thích hoa màu nào thôi. Đấy, còn những cái dòng em vừa lên là dòng hoa đại chị ạ, dòng hoa sai đại. Đấy, còn 5 chậu đấy tí em cho mọi người xem lại. Đấy. Đây, còn đây là 5 cái chậu 3 cái chậu combo 3. Đấy, em sẽ lên combo 3 này xong em sẽ giới thiệu lại cho mọi người cái mặt hoa của dòng combo 5. Trong combo 5 đấy có một dòng sai chung đấy chị Hương Rừng. Có một cây sai chung. Đây, màu hoa đầu tiên em sẽ lên cho mọi người là cái gì đấy? 1 2 1. Đây, một cây la con. Đây em lên 2 cây la con trong combo này cơ. Đấy, chú chớ chị đâu? Chú có phải chú cơ bản đấy cháu lại thấy chữ Hương Rừng. Đấy, cháu lại thấy chữ Hương Rừng. Thì cháu lại tưởng là cô tên là Hương. Nó khổ. Đấy, xong rồi nhìn cháu bản là cháu nhìn cái hình đại diện của chú nó xa đâm ra lại nhìn nó lóa. Rồi ok đấy, màu thứ hai cho mọi người là màu diện cũng là dòng la con nhưng đây thuộc của la con 2. Đây là của la con 2. Đấy, đây là của la con 2. Ok ạ. Rồi tiếp đến cho mọi người là gì? Màu tiếp là màu vàng của dòng trung thông. Của dòng trung thông. Đấy. Ok mọi người, toàn những cái dòng hoa gọi là đi thi đấu đấy, toàn dòng hoa đi thi đấu mọi người nhé. Rồi, combo lên cho bao nhiêu? 350. Nhanh mọi người nhé, 350 em bao ship cho mọi người luôn. 350 bao ship. Toàn bao ship hết thôi. Đấy, nên mọi người không phải lo tính ship của em nhé, trừ khi các bạn đi lẻ thôi. Nhớ cho em là ở live em các anh chị muốn đi lẻ 1-2 cây cũng được, nhưng đi lẻ 1-2 cây nó sẽ bị tính ship. Đấy, còn đi 3 cây là sao? Đi từ 3 cây, 5 cây, 10 cây vừa rẻ mà sao vừa được bao ship thì tội gì không đi đúng không ạ? Đấy, mua một cái combo của em bằng anh chị mua được gì, bằng anh chị mua được một cây một chậu khác rồi. Còn đây một combo 350k mọi người được hẳn 3 chậu luôn, 3 chậu như này. Đấy, 3 chậu như này. Đấy, mà chỉ có bao nhiêu 350k về bên em bao ship cho mọi người. Đấy, bên em bao ship. Ok chưa? Đấy, anh chị nào thích combo này nên cho em là combo số 2. Combo là combo số 2 này nhé. Combo số 3. Vườn cháu Hạ Long chú ạ. Vườn cháu Hạ Long. Vườn này vườn ngoài Bắc. Vườn này vườn cháu trồng ngoài Bắc. Vườn Bắc đầu tiên mà trồng cát số lượng lớn kinh khủng như này. Đấy là cái mà chắc cháu nghĩ là không vườn người Bắc nào trồng. Rồi ok, mặt hoa 5 cây. 5 cây thì đây em cho mọi người xem luôn là trong combo của anh Lâm. Anh Lâm anh vừa lấy. Đây của anh Lâm. Đây 5 màu hoa nó sẽ là như này. 5 màu hoa là như này. Đây 5 màu hoa chuẩn. Đấy. Dạ, thoải mái bác ạ. Bác ở đâu hả bác? Ở LA là bác ở đâu? Chứ còn mườn cháu thì vào Nam, từ Bắc vào Nam thoải mái mà. Đây là màu thứ 5 của nó. Đây là màu thứ 5 của nó. Đấy, và có 5 cây chuẩn và 5 cây sổ. Ok cho mọi người. Đấy, 5 cây chuẩn và 5 cây sổ. Đấy, cho mọi người xem từng màu hoa của nó. Đây, màu hoa đầu tiên. Có mèo thì nó cao hơn tầm vài chục chị Hoàng Thùy ạ. Có mèo nhưng mà hiện tại bây giờ tháng mèo phải tầm tháng, để em xem ở đây có mèo không. Mèo hôm trước là chị ấy chị lấy hết. Tại vì đây mà em không kích cây nên em cứ để lên tự nhiên thôi, cứ để cho hoa tự nhiên thôi, em không kích. Đấy, mặt hoa thứ hai. Nói chung là mà em cứ đẩy combo thì nó sẽ rất là rẻ cho mọi người. Đấy, còn các bác từ trong Nam ra Bắc, từ Bắc ra Nam, từ Nam vào Bắc thì nói chung là các bác yên tâm. Em thì em đi hàng miền Nam rất là nhiều luôn, chứ không phải là em không đi. Chứ mọi người cứ nghĩ là em biết mọi người sợ gì rồi, sợ từ Nam vào Nam là cây nó suy đúng không? Cây nó suy thì đấy là đối với dòng cây lon thì em mới sợ thôi. Chứ cây nhà em đi tầm 12-16 ngày trong thùng về vẫn bình thường. Em bị bom nhiều rồi mà. Đấy là thật sự luôn, đấy là em chỉ là sự. Đấy, em cũng nghĩ rằng về nó hỏng ấy, nhưng mà sau rồi quay về đến ngày em 12 ngày không vấn đề gì cả. 12 có 14 ngày về vẫn sao, về cây vẫn bình thường không vấn đề gì cả. Đấy, đây là combo 10 nhá. Dạ vâng, ok anh Trần Ngọc này. Đấy, anh Trần Ngọc là combo 10 này. Anh chị nào thích combo 10 thì báo em nhé. Ngày mai em sẽ giả đơn cho anh Trần Ngọc nhé. Đấy, xem anh Ngọc mà ngày mai xem đơn cảm thấy ok được thì em mới đi đơn. Đấy, cứ cảm thấy ok được thì em đi đơn. Đấy, combo 10. Combo 10 là nó sẽ có 306 này cộng với 116 này cộng với 372 123. Đấy bọn em phải ghi lại mã cơ. Cái này là bọn em còn phải ghi lại mã của nó cơ, chứ không phải là nhặt bớ phưa lên để đi đâu. Cộng 272 cộng 89 này. Đấy. Này là của anh Trần Ngọc. Anh Trần Ngọc. Rồi ok, em cảm ơn anh Trần Ngọc. Để sáng mai em gửi đơn cho anh. Để sáng mai em gửi đơn cho anh. Tại vì là tí nữa xuống live sớm thì em đi nhập đơn không rồi. Được thì tối em quay cho anh luôn. Thì sáng mai anh ngủ dậy anh chỉ được xem thôi. Rồi ok. 650. Đấy, ok. Đấy, anh chị nào thích combo 10 cứ bảo em nhé. Còn mọi người thích combo 3 để em lên combo 3 thì anh chị nào thích màu nào thì mọi người báo em màu đấy. Để anh xem là có cái chậu nào nó có cái màu nào nghèo thì bên em có một con trăm mấy đó. Mèo bên em thì rộ nhất ở tầm tháng 9. Rộ nhất vào tầm tháng 9 thì mèo rất là nhiều luôn. mùa này thì lác đác thôi, có cây không. Cổ nhất là em không thích nó cổ thế, muốn để cho mọi người được cái ra cái dàn hoa tự nhiên, ra cái dàn hoa tự nhiên hơn, về chơi nó tự nhiên, không phải thích khác gì cả. Cây nó chơi nó khỏe, nó bền cây, nhưng thích thì dễ lắm. Ít hoa này chỉ để cái loại này các bác mà chơi theo kiểu là chuẩn mặt hoa, nhưng mà nhưng mà ngược lại thì sao nó rất là nguy hiểm, nó rất nguy hiểm trong những một sự cây. Rồi, mèo bên này hiện tại bây giờ này, em chưa kiếm được nó được. Thế thôi, em vẫn cứ lên tặng lấy cái vàng này thôi. Còn cái bác nào mà yêu thích cái vàng này. Combo này thì có một cây con mèo, hello chị Nhung, combo 10 có 650k thôi anh Phước Hải ơi. Đấy, chị Nhàn ơi, chị muốn hỏi combo nào chị Nhàn? Combo 10 thì 650k, còn cái combo mà em vừa lên em vừa cầm trên tay là chỉ có 350k thôi. Đấy, combo em vừa cầm trên tay đây, đấy chị Nhàn. Đấy, combo 10 thì là 650k anh Phước Hải ơi, siêu tầm đấy. Siêu tầm gọi là sao? Gọi là quá rẻ luôn. Đấy, còn cái combo này 3 chọn như này là chỉ có 350k thôi. Rồi ok. 300k và được bao ship rồi, không tính ship. Combo nào bên em cũng bao ship hết. Đấy. 650k mà mọi người tính em còn bao ship thì còn nãy là bao nhiêu đâu đúng không? Mà cây thì cây to, cây nó không bé. Rồi đấy, một combo tiếp cho mọi người. Ba màu với cả nhà. Đấy. Combo này combo thứ tư nên cho em là combo thứ tư. Rồi combo này nó sẽ là những cái màu như nào? Đây, cái bảng màu anh em nó cầm nó cỡ dày như này. Đấy. Trong combo này có một cây con mèo, ấy. Không phải combo nào nhặt cũng có mèo đâu. Đầu tiên là nên cho mọi người màu đỏ này. Đấy, màu red này. Màu thứ hai là màu cam này, tùng noi orient này. Đấy, và màu cuối cùng, màu thứ ba là gì ạ? Màu thứ ba nó là một con máy màu mà khá là nổi năm nay đấy, màu khá nổi của năm nay ấy. Để xem lại kỹ lại xem lại đúng không? Thông xúc, đúng rồi, thông xúc là màu khá nổi năm nay. Đấy. Rồi combo này em báo trước là 350 nhé, 350 bao ship chưa? Đấy, combo này, đấy, hai màu này, với một cái màu nữa là màu gì ạ? Màu thông xúc, nó gọi là màu thông xúc. Cái gì ấy, em thấy nó khó đọc lắm. Đây nó đây này, đây, thông xúc đi này là màu này, màu này năm nay khá nổi luôn, em thấy đang gọi là gì ạ? Đang gọi là khá là nhiều nơi đang nổi đình nổi đám cái bông hoa này luôn. Đấy, rồi cả mỗi combo này là bao nhiêu? Là 350 cho mọi người. Ok chưa? 350 cho cả nhà. Cái cây thông xúc là cây đang có mèo nhá, cái cây này là cây đang có mèo.